Chapter 21:12. At this time, when Luo Fan was secretly shocked, the barrier between the realm of the individual cultivators and the realm of the Tao Master finally became illusory, and the connection between the two began to grow at an unprecedented speed. It was as if some invisible force was frantically strengthening the connection between the two in a very mysterious way. In a trance, Luo Fan seemed to hear some kind of rumbling sound coming from the realm of the individual cultivators. This was the sound produced by the entire realm of the individual cultivators being moved. The connection between the two began to connect and grow. In the end, more and more connections gradually connected and fused into one. With this change, the realm of the Tao Master also began to have an indescribable change. It was as if some huge existence was squeezing into the realm of the Tao Master from the outside, causing the realm of the Tao Master to begin to produce an indescribable distortion. This distortion spread throughout the nomological laws, time and space, and even all the matter in this realm, all the almost perfect heaven and earth. At this time, the sound spread throughout the whole world, so that all the creatures in this world, including the giant boy and the third senior brother who were fighting fiercely, could also hear this sound. At this time, the third senior brother's expression suddenly became extremely desperate. "You really did it," he murmured. At this time, the attack that he had intended to blast out suddenly became gradually unstable and then gradually dissipated, and his figure began to appear out of thin air in the sky. He lowered his head and looked at the giant boy below with an extremely desperate and resentful expression. At this time, the giant boy's face was full of satisfaction. It was as if the thing that he had spent endless time and energy pursuing was being completed. At this time, he did not want to attack the third senior brother anymore. The illusory space-time behind him constantly changed, dispersing the many illusory concepts' divine sense that he had blasted out, so that the whole world gradually returned to its original clarity. Even the surrounding chaos was gradually smoothed out. Everything looked like before their battle finally succeeded. From now on, we, the individual cultivators, have regained the right to cultivate on the path of the Tao Master. We are no longer inferior to others, the boy giant said with an intoxicated expression. At this time, the conspirator smiled and said, "Congratulations on the success of your plan, fellow Taoist. I can understand why he chose to raise the fallen land of oblivion, but I don't understand why you, a disciple of the Tao Master, would help him." The third senior brother said to the conspirator with an incomparably cold tone. The aura of the conspirator, which belonged to the Tao Master's disciples, could not be more obvious. Even if the third senior brother didn't know which Tao Master he was a disciple of, or who he was absolutely sure that he was a Tao Master's disciple. That's because we can get enough benefits from this. The conspirator smiled and said with an inexplicable expression, "The cultivation of the fourth level of the Tao Master is too difficult. He's doing this because he doesn't have the confidence to break through the fourth level and enter the fifth level." The boy giant answered with a smile. As he spoke, his body gradually shrank, and in the blink of an eye, he had shrunk to the size of a normal person. As he shrank, the illusory space-time behind him also began to shrink. In the blink of an eye, it had been compressed into a halo, floating behind his head, making him look like a Buddha. The conspirator looked at the halo behind the boy's head with an inexplicable envy in his eyes. Then he nodded and said, "Indeed, I've cultivated on the fourth level for hundreds of millions of years, but until now, I haven't been able to touch the edge of ascension. So I have to find another way from the third level. What benefits can you get from breaking the original arrangement? Enough for you to touch the realm of ascension." The third senior brother said incredulously, "Ha ha, although you're the third senior brother, you still underestimate the third level. Do you really think that the third level of the Tao Master's path only has the effect of suppressing one's cultivation and power?" The conspirator laughed at this time, showing an inexplicable disdain in his eyes. The third senior brother's heart shook. He was not willing to believe what the other party said, that he did not understand the third level of the Tao Master's path. After all, he thought that he was the strongest expert on the third level of the Tao Master's path and the person with the highest authority. He could even control this place to a certain extent and carry out the corresponding transformation. How could he not understand this place? However, he had to admit that there was a possibility that the other party's words were true. After all, this was the third level of the Tao Master's path. Based on the situation of the previous levels, the performance here was a little crude. The method of ascension was only to break through under suppression and obtain the strength of the false saint realm. There was obviously a gap between this and the great reputation of the third level of the Tao Master's path. Moreover, the person who said this was not an ordinary cultivator, but the cultivator who had returned from the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. The words spoken by such an existence were not likely to be shot without a target. You guys seem to have separated the third level and monopolized most of the cultivation resources on the third level, but aren't you also destroying the mysteries of the third level? The boy had an inexplicable disdain on his face at this moment. At this moment, the entire Tao Master's domain was constantly trembling and distorting. The scene of the rogue cultivator domain began to appear in the sky of the Tao Master's domain. As it appeared, all the living beings in the Tao Master's domain could clearly see its existence. They saw a vast and boundless world that they had never seen before appearing in the sky. In the sky, there were also countless living beings looking up at the sky. Their gazes seemed to have penetrated the barrier of endless time and space, directly seeing the scene in the Tao Master's domain. It was so much so that some cultivators even made eye contact with other cultivators, vaguely feeling that they were looking at the living beings of another world. The third senior brother looked up at the sky. His heart was filled with anger, unwillingness, and helplessness. Now, even if he was the third senior brother and had all kinds of authority in the Tao Master's domain, it was impossible for him to reverse the situation of the two domains merging again. After all, the one who was really driving this change was no longer the boy, nor was it the schemer, but the third level of the Tao Master's path itself. Or rather, it was the Tao Master's path itself. If he had the help of the Tao Master's disciples who had established the Tao Master's domain and the individual cultivator domain, he might be able to use the same method to divide the third level of the Tao Master's path. However, he had to pay a price that was 10 times or even 100 times more than what he had done in the beginning. It was just like the difficulty of pushing a forbidden shot out and catching a shot that had been thrown out and then pushing it back. The difficulty of separating the stable third level of the Tao Master's path was worlds apart from that of dividing the third level of the Tao Master's path, that was merging with that of splitting the stable third level of the Tao Master's path. Obviously, at this time, the third senior brother did not have any Tao Master's disciples, let alone the Tao Master's disciples. He was completely alone. Under such circumstances, he obviously had no way to deal with the drastic change in front of him. He could only watch the change helplessly. At this time, in the distance, Luo Fan had already fallen into an inexplicable state. In the eyes of an ordinary cultivator, the process of the rogue cultivator's domain and the Tao Master's domain merging back together might seem very normal. However, in his eyes, this change was as mysterious as the change that occurred at the moment when the world was created. At this moment, the endless changes produced at the intersection of the two domains shook, collided, distorted, influenced, and reconstructed each other. It was as if a supreme, true divine was in front of him, showing him how to build the Tao Master's path. At every moment, he was receiving an endless amount of messy information. The mysteries of heaven and earth, the mysteries of concepts, the fundamental mystery of the third level of the Tao Master's path, and so on and so forth. Everything was constantly injected into his heart at this time, making him feel that his worldview of the laws was strongly touched at every moment. Wisps of mysteries naturally integrated into his worldview of the laws, gradually making his worldview of the laws squirm and grow continuously. The rogue cultivator domain and the Tao Master's domain were originally part of the third level of the Tao Master's path. After the separation of the two, although it was still the Tao Master's path, as the boy had said, after the separation, it had actually become incomplete. No matter how profound and powerful the means of those Tao Masters were, they were still far inferior to a true divine. In fact, there was no comparison at all. Under such circumstances, even if they used exquisite means to maintain the integrity of the two, to maintain the mystery of the third level of the Tao Master's path, in the end, most of the mystery would inevitably be lost. After the loss of many mysteries, the Tao Master's domain and the rogue cultivator domain could still rely on the original mystery to help cultivators cultivate, allowing cultivators to grow at an unimaginably fast speed. But compared to the original, it would definitely be much inferior. In this way, it was easy to imagine what the change would be after the two merged at this time. The moment the two merged, the mystery that was originally lost due to the separation naturally began to gather again, once again condensing in the third level of the Tao Master's path that was about to be completed. And this process was actually a reproduction of the entire process of the Tao Masters building the third level of the Tao Master's path. In other words, it was equivalent to letting Luo Fan, who saw all these changes with his own eyes, see the process of the Tao Masters opening the third level of the Tao Master's path with his own eyes. That kind of harvest was easy to imagine. Obviously, the boy and the conspirator did not have such a clear understanding. At this moment, they were more looking forward to the mystery that would be revealed after the third level of the Tao Master's path was completed, but they missed the greatest treasure in the process of recombining. Only Luo Fan was able to accept the endless mysteries within without missing out at this moment. He could feel the various indescribable principles revealed during the process of recombining and reconstructing. Involuntarily, his worldview naturally emerged outside of his body and began to distort slightly. It seemed that every concept in it had gained vitality and began to squirm on its own, choosing its own position, choosing other concepts that it wanted to associate with, and reconstructing the entire worldview of the world of laws. This process had a huge impact on Luo Fan. Not only did it improve his cultivation realm, but it also made his worldview more perfect. It even affected the essence of his existence. During this process, Luo Fan's body collapsed with a loud bang, turning into countless mysterious rays of light that involuntarily integrated into the world of laws. It began to squirm and change along with every concept in the world of laws. In a trance, his mind became blurry. His perception of the outside world, his perception of time, his perception of the air conditioner, and even his perception of the laws of laws, his perception of concepts, and his perception of power began to become blurry, a kind of transformation that had never happened since he stepped onto the Tao Master's path began to appear in his body. The process of the overlap between the Tao Master's domain and the individual cultivator's domain was quite wonderful. During this process, even time was obviously changing. Moreover, because of the intensity and degree of mystery of this change, the impact on time had even surpassed the time dimension and reached the extent of even affecting the time dimension of the entire Tao Master's path. In other words, in this process of overlap, time no longer had any meaning for the living beings in it. If they were to immerse themselves in it, their perception of time during the entire process of change would become idealistic. However, Luo Fan was now completely immersed in it and had even completely lost his perception of time. The time that he had spent in his body had become extremely strange. When the two truly merged, he seemed to have spent billions of trillions of years, but also seemed like only a few moments had passed. As for how much time had passed, even he, who had finally come back to his senses, was completely unable to determine. After coming back to his senses, he only knew that the fifth tribulation, which he had originally sensed would take at least another 300 billion years to arrive, had been reduced to less than 1 billion years. In other words, it would arrive in more than 900 million years. This reduction was so great that it was difficult for him to determine whether it was because his cultivation realm had such a huge increase, or if he had really spent nearly 300 billion years in the process of the merger. With a slight thought, countless rays of light emerged from the worldview of the laws and began to turn into streams of light, condensing in the void in front of the worldview. Not long after, a Luo fan was condensed. Compared to before, the current Luo fan's aura that belonged to the worldview of the laws was even more intense. At first glance, he seemed to be the manifestation of the worldview of the laws. At this moment, the power of his god art had increased by countless times compared to before he had split it up. If he had only been able to control the indestructible concept god art in the past, then he could now reach the height of the indestructible concept god art in almost any of his god arts. Any god art formed from any god art could also reach the height of the indestructible concept god art. It could be said that at this moment, every move he made had the power of the indestructible concept god art in the past. This kind of improvement was so great that it could not be described with words. Since his body had undergone such a huge change, his worldview had also undergone a huge change. Currently, the worldview of the laws was still in the shape of a human, and it still looked like his body. However, the specks of light that appeared had already connected into a whole. Although the original specks of light were still brighter than other places, the difference was no longer as great as before. In terms of brightness, the brightness of the areas that were bright and the areas that weren't bright enough could even be said to be on the same level. Due to such changes, the current worldview of the laws looked like Luo Fan's light form. The state that originally didn't look like a real person and was only a human silhouette had completely changed. Vaguely, there was a strange vitality condensing in the form of Luo Fan that the worldview of the laws had transformed into. Due to this vitality, the worldview of the laws no longer looked like a worldview. Instead, it looked like a real cultivator, a cultivator with spiritual wisdom and the ability to think for himself. It's really incredible and mysterious. Looking at the worldview of the laws, Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh. His sigh naturally couldn't be because of his worldview of the laws. After all, it was condensed by him, and he could control everything in it and was also quite clear about it. What was the difference between praising the worldview of the laws and boasting? What he was praising was the third level of the road to Tao Master. Chapter 21:13. The worldview shook slightly and then dissipated into nothingness. The worldview is the best experience of reading novels. The worldview itself was just a collection of ideas, and it could be said to be a completely idealistic existence. If one wanted to release its might, then it would naturally possess supreme might, and if one wanted to put it away, then it would naturally turn invisible and vanish without a trace. At this moment, the worldview seemed to have dissipated, but in fact, it had only returned to Luo Fan's body. The moment he woke up, he glanced over and saw the entire Tao Master's domain, or rather, the entire third level of the Tao Master's path. Now, the entire third level of the Tao Master's path was completely different from what he had seen before. The original appearance that seemed like a normal world had completely disappeared. At this moment, although the entire third level of the Tao Master's path was still a world, it was no longer a normal world. Here, all matter was in a state of constant change. Every matter, whether it was air, the world's essence energy, or all kinds of things, even the nomological laws, time, and space itself, were in an absolutely unstable state. It was like the stone under his feet. At this moment, it was constantly changing from stone to a world. Sometimes it was a complete stone, and suddenly it turned into an unknown number of worlds, constantly condensing and constantly dispersing. All kinds of unimaginable mysteries were constantly released from it, which made Luo Fan feel thoughtful. He faintly comprehended the mysteries of the composition of the world, and this stone was just one of the most common things in the world. Apart from this, everything else was in a similar state. At every moment, there were countless profound truths emerging from the changes of the many substances, and they were received by him. At this moment, in the face of such a change, Luo Fan's expression was a little inexplicable. With a thought, his figure was already in midair. Looking into the distance, A large area of the third level of the Tao Master's path was imprinted in his eyes. At the very least, within the range that he could see and sense, all matter had become like that piece of rock. Even living beings were in a similar state. They were constantly changing, and constantly displaying all sorts of profound principles and profundities. If there was anything different, perhaps only the cultivators who entered from the outside of the Tao Master's path remained in their original state. After the upheaval, the number of living beings in this strange world had increased by at least 100 times. Originally, the number of living beings within the range of his senses was only in the hundreds of millions. But now, he needed at least 10 billion units to barely calculate the number of cultivators within his sensing range. At this moment, all the cultivators seemed to be slightly panicked and bewildered, whether they were rogue cultivators or disciples of Tao Masters. To them, the people at their level were unable to comprehend what had just happened. Naturally, he did not know why the world had undergone such a drastic change in the blink of an eye. However, it was obvious that to those rogue cultivators, this kind of environment had become even more wonderful. It was easier for them to obtain benefits from it. As a result, the independent cultivators accepted this change at an unimaginable speed. Very soon, they began to disperse like a swarm of locusts, scurrying all over the world in search of the most suitable resources for their cultivation and the best place to cultivate. In comparison, the disciples of Tao Masters were different. The disciples of Tao Masters who were able to remain here despite the various changes were naturally existences that could not display their cultivation in the third level of the Tao Master's path that had not reached the false saint stage. To them, the changes in the surrounding cultivation environment had an unimaginable impact on them. The upheaval just now not only made it more difficult for them to cultivate, but too many new changes had directly disrupted their cultivation that they had already entered, causing them to be at a loss for what to do. However, their reaction speed was much slower than those rogue cultivators. After a while, the disciples of the Tao Masters left their original places one after another to search for cultivation resources. A vitality that did not exist before gradually appeared in the third level of the Tao Master's path. With a thought, Luo Fan's figure flashed, and with a few teleportations, he had already arrived at the battlefield that he had left from before. In other words, it was where the giant boy, the third senior brother, and the conspirator were. At this moment, the situation here was already vastly different from before. At this moment, the third senior brother looked as if he had lost his parents, and his face was filled with despair. On the other hand, the boy's face was filled with satisfaction, and his entire body was trembling with excitement. I finally succeeded. As expected, my calculations were correct. After doing this, I have obtained the greatest authority and become a true ruler. At this moment, the boy said with an extremely excited expression. As he spoke, a strong light was suddenly released from his body. Although this light was invisible, it directly shook the entire world, causing the entire world, or rather, the entire third level of the Tao Master's path to undergo a subtle change. All kinds of indescribable light appeared everywhere, changing along with the light released from his body. It was as if they were responding to the light released from his body. Faintly, some subtle and mysterious changes continued to condense at this moment, causing the boy's figure to seem to continue to grow. Of course, this was just a feeling. In fact, the boy's figure was still the same as before, and he still looked like a boy. There was no increase in his size, nor any changes. The reason why people felt that he was growing and becoming taller was because his presence was constantly increasing. It was precisely because his presence was constantly increasing that he gave off such a feeling. Congratulations, ruler! At this moment, the conspirator was overjoyed and bowed to the boy. His expression was so fanatical that it was as if he was a fanatic who had seen his god. This embarrassing performance did not arouse any contempt from the other Tao Master's disciples. On the contrary, at this moment, the other Tao Master's disciples also bowed at the same time, proclaiming their congratulations to the ruler, and behaved even more sincerely than the conspirator. Ha ha ha! At this moment, the boy laughed out loud. Become a ruler. The third senior brother had a look of shock on his face. At this moment, a black fog suddenly emerged from the third senior brother's body, and in the blink of an eye, it had completely enveloped him. The black fog was faint at first, but as time passed, it became thicker and thicker, and in the end, it turned into a black curtain that directly enveloped his entire body. This black mist was so mysterious that it even emitted an indescribable, baleful aura. It was filled with an aura of despair, depravity, destruction, and death. Just looking at this black mist was enough to cause despair to naturally grow in one's heart. This is your karma. At this moment, the boy's laughter gradually stopped. He looked at the third senior brother with a cold expression and said indifferently. His voice directly spread throughout the area and even reached the third senior brother's ears. The third senior brother was slightly taken aback. Karma? What karma? As he spoke, he looked at his entire body with some doubt, wanting to see where the so-called karma was. Unfortunately, at this moment, his eyes, his ears, his sense of touch, his sense of smell, and even all his other senses have been covered by the karma. Therefore, he could not see the existence of the black fog at all, nor could he sense the various auras released by the black fog. In his senses, there was nothing different about his body compared to before. He was still quietly floating in the void, and his entire body was still inexplicably refreshed. This was clearly completely covered by the black fog, but he was completely unaware of the strangeness, which made the many Tao Master's disciples feel a chill from the bottom of their hearts. Even the boy showed an inexplicable look of pity at this moment. After all, the third senior brother was the disciple of the strongest Tao Master on the third level of the Tao Master's path. Although all his senses were covered by the black fog, making it difficult for him to see the truth. In the end, there were still other ways to make him aware of his own state. Soon, an inexplicable light began to be released from his body and began to illuminate his entire body. Finally, the black fog began to surge at this moment. As the black fog surged, the traces of its existence were finally discovered by the third senior brother. At that moment, he could not help but feel inexplicably terrified. Wave after wave of concept powers shot out from his body, continuously condensing and weaving in the air. In the end, it turned into an extremely complicated halo that fell towards his body. Sizzle, 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 sizzle. The moment the halo and the black fog came into contact, this strange sound began to be produced uncontrollably. It continued to spread in all directions, causing the surrounding area to be shrouded in this strange sound. With this change, the black fog continued to stir and evaporate, gradually becoming more and more unrestrained. However, at this moment, the black fog was still continuously being produced from within his body, continuously replenishing the surrounding black fog. No matter how much of the black fog dissipated, it would be replenished by the same amount of black fog, allowing the black fog to maintain its state of being so thick that it could conceal everything about him. How can there be so many karma? At this moment, the third senior brother roared in shock and anger. How can there be so many karma? The boy's expression was quite strange at this time, as if he was looking at a fool. In his opinion, wasn't the reason for this obvious? They, the disciples of the Tao Masters, completely separated the third level of the Tao Master's path. How many expert cultivation paths were cut off by this? How many cultivators could not break through for hundreds of millions of years because of this? There is no need to say how much resentment, unwillingness, and the deepest negative emotions in their hearts were. In the past, the cultivators whose cultivation was affected by their methods didn't know the root cause, or they couldn't find a target for their various negative emotions. Thus, they just hung high and didn't fall. But now, the third level of the Tao Master's path had been restored. Even if the cultivators themselves did not realize that the target for their resentment and other negative emotions had appeared, their instincts and their cultivation wills, under the guidance of the third level of the Tao Master's path, had already discovered the existence of the third senior brother. And after those negative emotions descended on the third senior brother, they naturally transformed into the incomparably strong, unbreakable karma. In fact, the reason why the boy could become the new ruler of the third level of the Tao Master's Path was not only because he had completed the reunification of the third level of the Tao Master's Path and naturally received the blessing of the third level, but more importantly, it was because of the endless gratitude of the itinerant cultivators towards him. Resentment and other negative emotions would condense into karma, and this kind of positive emotion of gratitude could naturally produce something similar to merit, which was reflected on him. It was like this, making him the ruler of the third level of the Tao Master's Path. As he became the ruler, his original sin of going against the Tao Master's Path was naturally eliminated. Moreover, according to his will, the sins of the disciples of the other Tao ancestors who had also gone against the Tao Master's Path had also been eliminated by him. In other words, from now on, they could release themselves in the third level of the Tao Master's Path without any restrictions, and they no longer needed to worry about the power of the Tao Master's prison descending upon them and pulling them into the depths of the Tao Master's prison. How could this be? Why? The third senior brother continuously roared at this moment. His roars were filled with panic and doubt. Hearing this, the boy only sighed in pity and turned to the void. In the end, he is still unwilling to believe the truth. Very sad, isn't it? Indeed. Deep in his heart, he already knows the reason. It's just that he is unwilling to believe it. At this moment, such a voice came from the void he was looking at. This voice was the voice of Luo Fan. Then, in that void, Luo Fan's figure emerged. Obviously, just now Luo Fan hid here and watched everything. And the boy also discovered his existence because he was the ruler of the third level of the Tao Master's Path. Seeing his appearance, the conspirator was slightly stunned, and then immediately became furious. How dare you show up? If it weren't for you, we wouldn't have to go through so much trouble to complete the plan. Hearing this, Luo Fan glanced at him, but did not bother to pay attention to him. Indeed, if it weren't for Luo Fan, the third senior brother's doppelganger would have been imprisoned there, unable to move at all. And the third senior brother's real body would not have stopped halfway, and would have directly rushed here according to their plan. In that case, he would have directly fallen into the traps set by the boy. At that time, the authority would be taken away and replaced, and it would be too fast. How could it be like now, where the conspirator had to risk his life and even pay a huge price to barely replace his clone? In the end, he had to spend an unknown amount of cultivation to lure the third senior brother's main body over. It could be said that it was because of Luo Fan's actions that the conspirator had to pay a price that he didn't need to pay and waste too much energy. However, how could he blame Luo Fan for this? If it weren't for the fact that they wanted to plot against Luo Fan and imprison and exile him together, would he have taken action? Since they forced Luo Fan to take action, what right did they have to blame him now? He believed that anyone with a little bit of rationality would be able to see all of this clearly, and there was no need for him to explain it all. Moreover, even if the other side was not rational, he would not be afraid of them at all if they wanted to fight against him. Under such circumstances, how could he have the mood to pay attention to the accusation of the conspirator? At this moment, the boy smiled and said, "Don't be rude. This Taoism fellow has remarkable powers. If it weren't for his mercy, I'm afraid you would have been sent to the Tao Master's prison by now. How could you wait until now to enjoy the fruits of victory?" Hearing this, the conspirator and the other Tao Master's disciples were shocked, and their eyes faintly revealed a look of disbelief. However, it was obvious that the boy had an unimaginable authority in their hearts. Even if they were not willing to believe that Luo Fan had already shown mercy, no one dared to question it to his face. At this time, Luo Fan just smiled faintly and did not care about their obvious disbelief at all. In fact, the boy had overestimated him. Now, he could easily deal with the many Tao Master's disciples and the conspirator. Even if they rearranged the formation, it would still be the same. However, that was only for now. Before, it was difficult for him to do this after he had the opportunity to recombine the third level of the road to Tao Master. At that time, although he did not use his full strength, he did not have much strength left. In fact, the boy's statement of mercy was not worthy. Chapter 21:15. The fact that the third senior brother was able to reach this level meant that he was absolutely decisive and extremely charismatic. However, no matter how decisive and charismatic he had no choice but to hesitate when faced with such a choice. The boy seemed to have purposely mentioned this solution in order to see the third senior brother's dilemma. At this moment, he was smiling as he watched the third senior brother's dilemma. His expression was as carefree as it could be and as happy as it could be. Not long after, the black mist on the third senior brother's body seemed to seep into his body at an even faster rate. The invasion of the third senior brother's life essence also became faster. At this moment, the third senior brother finally understood that he could not hesitate any longer. With a loud roar, his power surged, and multiple projections rushed out of the black fog. During the process, they trembled continuously and gradually changed their forms. Not long after, the projections had already left the third level of the Down Master's path and were heading towards the second level. It was not easy to go against the Down Master's path. It was even more difficult than ascending. However, judging from the existence of the boy in front of him, the disciples of the Down Masters on the fourth level of the Down Master's path, and the numerous cultivators on the third level that Luo Fan had seen on the second level of the Down Master's path, he knew that it was not difficult for a cultivator who truly wanted to overcome this difficulty. Even ordinary cultivators, or even independent cultivators, could do it. How could the third senior brother, as the strongest disciple of the Down Masters on the third level, fail to do it? Furthermore, the third senior brother didn't care about the final outcome. Instead, he needed the power of the Down Master's prison to be triggered during the process. If he wanted the final result and to safely reach the next level, he naturally had to conceal all his means and try his best to hide from the Down Master's prison. That would obviously make the entire process extremely troublesome and dangerous. In fact, that was the true difficulty of going against the Down Master's prison. What he needed now was not the final result. The situation was obviously different. Without the final result, he no longer needed to care about the process of concealing the Down Master's prison. This saved him a lot of trouble and also shortened the time it took for the projections to reach their goal. In the blink of an eye, the projections had already disappeared from the third level. At the same time, the power of the Down Master's prison began to appear out of thin air and directly wrapped around the third senior brother, trying to pull him out of the third level and into the depths of the Down Master's prison. However, it was a pity that this power was not very strong. It dissipated as soon as the black fog rushed at it, and it was unable to achieve its goal. Seeing this, the third senior brother knew that the power of the Down Master's prison was not enough. In other words, he had not broken enough rules of the Down Master's path. With a thought, the numerous projections that he had sent into the second level of the Down Master's path began to take action and began to wreak havoc on the second level. They continuously attacked the cultivators on the second level while continuously imprisoning them. It was a huge taboo to enter the Down Master path of the first level. It was to violate the Down Master's path. The result of wantonly wreaking havoc on such a foundation was already very obvious. In the end, more and more power of the Down Master's prison appeared out of thin air and wrapped around the third senior brother. It constantly collided with the karma around the third senior brother, creating all sorts of increasingly powerful impacts. The karma continued to grow in the process, and the power of the Down Master's prison continued to increase. In the end, the area where the third senior brother was located turned into an increasingly chaotic mess. The surging chaos continued to spread in all directions, and it seemed like a large chaotic sky was continuously expanding. Seeing this scene, whether it was Luo Fan, the boy, or the other disciples of the Down Master's path, none of them dared to touch it. They could only retreat and quickly get away from the third senior brother. The reason for this was very simple. After all, it was the interaction between the power of the Down Master's prison and the karma. There was no need to mention the power of the Down Master's prison. Anyone who came into contact with it would be directly pulled into the Down Master's prison. If they resisted, they might even be thrown into an even deeper Tao Master's prison. This was something that even Luo Fan was unwilling to do. Not to mention the numerous cultivators who had broken the rules and returned from the 4th level of the Tao Master's path. Needless to say, the karma was the resentment and dissatisfaction of countless itinerant cultivators from ancient times to the present and even in the future. If one came into contact with it, the impact on one's mind would be unimaginable. Under such circumstances, who would be willing to come into contact with it? The power of the karma and the Tao Master's prison increased at the same time. However, in the end, one was supported by the Tao Master's prison, while the other could only be supported by the numerous itinerant cultivators. The difference in the support of the two resulted in the final outcome of which of the two parties gained the upper hand. After a few days, the power of the Tao Master's prison finally suppressed all the karma, just as the karma was about to completely infect the 3rd senior brother's life essence. It directly enveloped the 3rd senior brother and disappeared without a trace with a tremble. At this moment, the karma began to tumble frantically, searching everywhere and constantly spreading in an attempt to find the 3rd senior brother. However, it was a pity that given the status of the Tao Master's prison, how could it be so easily found? The karma continued to tumble at this moment, but in the end, it could only dissipate powerlessly. Unknowingly, it completely disappeared. With the disappearance of the karma and the power of the Tao Master's prison, the chaotic sky that had appeared due to the existence of the two parties also gradually began to dissipate and gradually closed up. In a short while, it had completely returned to its original appearance. The world became clear again. At a glance, it was as if the upheaval of the past few years had not happened at all. This should be the last time we see him. The boy chuckled at this moment. Luo Fan immediately knew what he meant. The boy was clearly saying that the 3rd senior brother would never be able to reincarnate and would never be able to escape from the Tao Master's prison. He immediately smiled and said, "Isn't this what fellow Taoist hopes for?" The depth of the Tao Master's prison was unimaginable. The depth of a cultivator being thrown into the Tao Master's prison corresponded to the power of the Tao Master's prison that had appeared to capture them. Based on the intensity of the power of the Tao Master's prison, the depth that the 3rd senior brother would be thrown into was clearly unimaginable. At that depth, even if the 3rd senior brother's soul was not directly shattered and he would never be able to reincarnate, he would definitely be imprisoned in an unimaginably distant future. Under such circumstances, it was obvious that the 3rd senior brother, who had triggered such intense power of the Tao Master's prison, would not be able to appear before them again. Of course, the boy chuckled, his expression full of joy. "Ruler, although this person is a rogue cultivator, he was previously on our enemy's side. Now, why don't we?" At this moment, the conspirator said to the boy. With that, he even looked at Luo Fan with a malicious gaze. Looking at his expression, it seemed that he could not wait for the boy to immediately suppress him and then cut him into endless pieces so that he would never be able to reincarnate. At this moment, the boy smiled and looked at Luo Fan, not saying a word. At this moment, Luo Fan also looked quite relaxed. He just glanced at the conspirator indifferently. There was not the slightest hint of panic in his eyes, but absolute confidence. If it was before he had obtained the endless mysteries of the 3rd level of the Tao Master's path, he might have been a little worried that so many experts would attack him at the same time. After all, the number and precision of the concept divine ability he had mastered at that time was not satisfactory. But obviously, the situation was completely different now. Now, he did not care what these experts in front of him would do to him. Even if one of them had become a ruler of the 3rd level of the Tao Master's path, he could control a large part of the powerful power of the 3rd level of the Tao Master's path. At this moment, the boy shook his head and said, "Forget it. We have our own objectives when we come back. There is no need to complicate matters." At this moment, the boy shook his head and said, looking at Luo Fan with an inexplicable admiration, "Ruler." At this moment, the conspirator exclaimed, obviously unable to understand why the boy would make such a decision. After all, he was now a ruler, and in the third level, he could be considered almost invincible. Are my words not clear enough? The boy frowned and said indifferently. Seeing this expression, the conspirator's body trembled, and an inexplicable fear emerged in the depths of his eyes. He immediately lowered his head and said, "No, the ruler said it very clearly." "Then let's go," the boy said faintly, and as he spoke, his figure gradually blurred and soon disappeared without a trace. Seeing this, the bodies of the other Tao masters and the conspirator also shook slightly, and soon they also disappeared without a trace. In such a short period of time, only Luo Fan was left quietly floating in the air. What a pity, I lost a chance to test my methods. At this moment, Luo Fan sighed. Ever since he had such a great improvement, he had not really tested his methods to see how much they had improved. Of course, although he was looking forward to such an opportunity, he would not be like a mad dog that would bite everything. If the boy and the conspirator attacked him directly, he would naturally not waste such a good opportunity to test his methods. However, if they did not attack and directly retreated, he would not take the initiative to provoke them. After all, this was the third level of the Tao Master's Path, and the boy was now a ruler of the third level of the Tao Master's Path. If they really fought, he naturally would not worry about being killed by the other party. But in that case, even if he could win, it would inevitably become extremely inconvenient in the third level of the Tao Master's Path, and in the end, it might even affect his own cultivation. He naturally would not do such a thing if it was not necessary. Floating here, his heart moved slightly. He raised his hand, and the source of the conflict between him and the other Tao Masters appeared in his hand. The Tao Foundation formed by the valley. This Tao Foundation had not changed much compared to before. It was still mysterious, and it still showed the infinite mysteries of the infinite worldview. The Tao Foundation, I wonder how much it can improve me. He murmured, and with a shake of his body, he had already disappeared in this area. Time gradually passed. Back then, the upheaval that affected the entire third level of the Tao Master's Path had happened hundreds of thousands of years ago. During these hundreds of thousands of years, the situation in the entire third level of the Tao Master's Path had changed every moment. But now, it had unknowingly changed to a state that the many Tao Masters did not dare to imagine. Now, the entire third level of the Tao Master's Path no longer had empires, but there were countless forces. These forces were distributed in almost every area of the entire third level of the Tao Master's Path. They were established by many independent cultivators, and each force occupied an area of cultivation resources. Each force also had its own characteristics and even advantages. Such a structure undoubtedly made the entire third level of the Tao Master's Path more chaotic than before. But at the same time, it also made this place appear even more lively, and also made the cultivation atmosphere many times denser. As for the Tao Master's disciples, although most of them had been forced to ascend to the fourth level, but after hundreds of thousands of years of development, the number of Tao Master's disciples had unknowingly increased. After all, there were Tao Master's disciples ascending from the second level at every moment. In this way, after hundreds of thousands of years, in the third level of the Tao Master's Path, although it was no longer possible for the Tao Master's disciples to have an absolute advantage, they were no longer the minority race in the past. In fact, among the countless forces, the Tao Master's disciples occupied as much as 30%. The reason for this was very simple. After all, on the same level, the strength of the Tao Master's disciples was many times stronger than the independent cultivators on this day, on a newly built ascension platform. A cultivator who had just ascended to the third level of the Tao Master's Path was dumbfounded as he looked at the dozens of powerful cultivators guarding around him. Hurry up, don't block the way. Go there and register. Then choose a place to do hard labor for a few years. A cultivator dressed as a soldier looked at the confused cultivator and shouted impatiently. Hearing this, the cultivator who had just ascended came back to his senses and said, "What's going on? Did I ascend to the wrong place? Is this really not an ordinary immortal world, But the third level of the Tao Master's Path? You're not wrong. This was how it was here. Hurry up. There's still people waiting behind. The soldier said impatiently. As he spoke, he extended his palm. An extraordinary power surged out, turning into a huge palm that grabbed at the burly man who had just ascended. When the ascendant saw the incoming palm, a cold smile appeared on his face. You dare to use such a lowly trick against me? As he spoke, he mobilized his power to destroy the palm in front of him. He even wanted to teach the cultivator dressed as a soldier a lesson. However, when he looked around, he noticed that the surrounding cultivators were all gloating, as if he had done something stupid. While he was hesitating, he quickly realized that he had really done something stupid. That was because even though the power within his body was surging, it had already activated it with all his might. However, in reality, not a single bit of his strength and might was transmitted out of his body. He did not trigger the supreme might that should have erupted under his activation. It was as if what he had just done was just an extremely ordinary stretch of his palm. What happened? Where's my power? The cultivator could not even maintain his composure due to the sudden change. He could not help but exclaim, and his eyes were filled with intense shock. Another stupid person who did not sense the changes in the world. Aside from an unknown person entered the cultivator's ears. Then he discovered that he was directly grabbed by a huge palm, and his body was pulled away from where he was without any ability to resist. As the world spun around him, he was forcefully smashed in front of the counter that was only a few hundred feet away from the original ascension platform. The impact of the moment he landed made him feel as if his body was going to completely collapse under the impact. An indescribable pain swept through his entire body, and he could not stand up for a long time. The cultivator's heart was filled with humiliation and resentment. He tried his best to mobilize his power and the power of his divine sense, wanting to activate it. There's no need to try anymore. That's the characteristic of the third level. No matter how powerful you are, no matter how powerful your divine sense is, or how incredible your means are, you can't use even a little bit of it. An ancient voice entered the cultivator's ears. The cultivator tried again countless times, but in the end, it was useless. He could only turn his head to look at the source of the voice. It was from an extremely old man behind the counter. Chapter 21:16. What's going on? Why is this place completely different from what I imagined? The cultivator's face was full of confusion as he murmured, Phoenix update, fast please search. Fellow Taoist, have you forgotten where you are? This is the path to becoming a Tao sovereign. What's so strange about some unexpected things happening here? The old man raised his hand and released a surge of extraordinary power to help the cultivator up. But no matter what, it can't be so vulgar. What's the difference between this and the ordinary immortal realm? How can it be a place for people of our level to cultivate? The cultivator still couldn't figure it out. Every level of the Tao Master's Path is just a transit point for us. We only have one goal when we step on any level of the Tao Master's Path, and that is to ascend to a higher level. As long as this premise is met, anything can happen. It's reasonable for this world to exist in any form. The old man said disapprovingly, could it be that sending the ascenders to work in the mines is beneficial to ascension? The cultivator was even more incredulous. For you, there are benefits, but it's not great. However, for others, there are great benefits. The old man said with a smile. At this moment, another cultivator appeared on the ascension platform. Obviously, he was a new ascender. The ascender was at a loss. Obviously, he couldn't understand the third level of the Tao Master's Path. A similar process was taking place on the ascension platform. In just a few breaths of time, the ascender was also thrown in front of the counter where the cultivator and the old man were. How could this be? I worked so hard to ascend, but I didn't come here to work in the mines. The ascender roared. His voice contained extreme anger and unwillingness. Don't vent. The goal of cultivating in the third level of the Tao Master's Road is to regain the extraordinary power and unlock the power you possess in the third level of confinement. At this time, the old man said, cultivators like you who have just ascended do not have any extraordinary powers. Here, you're no different from ordinary people. It is natural for you to be oppressed. However, you don't have to be discouraged. You only need to mine for 10,000 years, and you'll be able to obtain the most basic cultivation method of extraordinary power. After that, you'll be able to truly set foot on the path of cultivation and won't need to mine anymore. Cultivation technique? A look of disdain appeared on the faces of the two cultivators. They were the supreme existences who had passed through layers of the Tao Master's path with their own efforts. Such an existence had already reached an unimaginable level of confidence in himself. Under such circumstances, why would they think that they needed someone else to teach them cultivation methods? In their minds, no matter what world it was, no matter what shackles and limitations there were, as long as other people could cultivate transcendent power, they would definitely be able to cultivate transcendent power with their own cultivation methods and embark on the path of cultivation. With such a mentality, how could they not be disdainful of the deal of exchanging 10,000 years for the cultivation method of transcendent power? The old man had obviously seen this kind of cultivators many times. At this time, he just laughed and said, "Don't worry, the contract is written clearly. As long as you can create your own cultivation method of transcendent power in 10,000 years, not only will you be able to leave early, but you will also receive a great reward. If you're willing to hand over your transcendent power, the reward will at least be 10 times higher. If the cultivation method of transcendent power is profound enough, it is also possible to obtain the projection of the Tao Foundation." Speaking of the projection of the Tao Foundation, even the calm old man could not help but have a look of longing on his face. The Tao Foundation? Projection? The two cultivators looked at each other. Naturally, they had heard of these two terms, but when combined together, they had never heard of it. The Tao Foundation, as the name suggested, was a certain kind of foundation that was important to achieving Tao. Even if they had never seen such an existence, they could understand how important it was. However, the projection of the Tao Foundation? What was that? What? It's not even the Tao Foundation. It's just a projection. What's the point? The first cultivator showed a look of disdain. Ha! At this time, laughter came from the side, and there was a strong sense of disdain in it. At this time, the two turned around and found that at some unknown time, there were already more than 10 soldiers surrounding them. Clearly, at this time, apart from a few soldiers, the other soldiers were quite free. They had the time to listen to things that they found funny, and to look down on people that they felt deserved to look down on. At this time, a soldier said indifferently, "What do you think the Tao Foundation is? Just a projection? Do you know that a projection of the Tao Foundation is enough for you to ascend to the 4th level in 100,000 years? Do you know the value of a projection of the Tao Foundation in the 3rd level? It would take at least 10 billion years for you to mine in order to touch that value. You're actually disdainful of a projection of the foundation of Tao." Another soldier sneered. Hearing this, the two cultivators couldn't help but turn red. One could only mine in 10 billion years, and obtaining one was enough for a cultivator who had just ascended to the 3rd level to ascend to the 4th level in 100,000 years. The value of such an existence could be said to be far beyond their imagination. Thinking about their previous disdainful attitude, they simply wished that a hole would immediately appear in the ground for them to crawl into. All right, what's so strange about newcomers not knowing? Aren't you also newcomers?" The old man couldn't stand it anymore and shouted with a frown. Hearing this, the smiles on the soldiers' faces faded. They immediately snorted and dispersed. "It's good that you're confident, but from this reward, you should know how difficult it is to create your own extraordinary power cultivation method. I'm not afraid to tell you that in the hundreds of thousands of years since this system was established, tens of billions of cultivators have been sent to mine. Among them, less than 10,000 have created their own extraordinary power cultivation method. Among them, not a single cultivator has been able to obtain the projection of the Tao Foundation. Therefore, you too should just obediently mine and wait for the 10,000 years to pass before exchanging for the cultivation method." The old man sighed and said to the two cultivators, "Tens of billions, 10,000. Hearing this ratio, the two of them couldn't help but be shocked. Their expressions were filled with amazement. Only now did they know how difficult it was to create their own cultivation method. It must be said that although they were confident, they didn't think that they were that outstanding. They didn't think that they could truly surpass almost all cultivators. In other words, they didn't think that they were among the tens of billions of people. Under such circumstances, they naturally understood how difficult it was to create their own extraordinary power cultivation method while mining for 10,000 years at this moment. The two of them looked at each other and finally bowed toward the old man. They said, "Thank you for your guidance, Senior." From a moment they saw the old man, they couldn't ignore the kindness that he had shown them. They couldn't help but thank an existence that was able to express kindness to them without any conflict of interest. Because of the same experience, at this moment, the two cultivators had already established a faint connection. Their positions had unknowingly become the same. Seeing them do this, the old man smiled and said, "There's no need for that. I'm also someone who's experienced it, so I naturally understand your helplessness. Come, let's register first." The third level was completely different from the previous two levels of Tao Master. Your previous experience in the previous two levels isn't very suitable here. In the future, you must carefully understand this level. Hearing this, the two cultivators hurriedly thanked the old man. There was naturally nothing much to say about the following registration. The old man didn't even care whether the names they gave were real or fake. In fact, in the registration register, the real information was probably less than 1%. However, it was obvious that neither the old man nor the force behind him cared about this. After all, although they were oppressing those cultivators, at the end of the day, it was just a transaction. As long as those who were oppressed were willing to do as they wanted, it didn't matter how fake the register information was. After the two cultivators registered, they were taken to a huge transmission formation. For cultivators like them, every single one of them had experienced teleportation arrays before. In fact, they had constructed teleportation arrays countless of times. However, this was something that happened a long time ago. Ever since they obtained the ability to move through space and time, things like teleportation arrays had almost been removed from their lives. At this time, when they had become experts of the three tribulations and arrived at the third level of the Tao Master's path, they actually saw a transmission formation again when they were only a few steps away from the Tao Master realm. Moreover, they needed to use this transmission formation to reach the place where they were oppressed. This kind of disparity made the two of them feel bad once again. This transmission formation was able to take shape and function in the third level of the Tao Master's path. Naturally, its structure was exquisite. At this moment, even with the extremely high knowledge of the two cultivators, they couldn't understand this transmission formation at all. They could only see that every node, every line, every rune, and every talisman in the transmission formation seemed to be built by the infinite heaven and earth. As the power flowed and changed, it contained mysteries that they couldn't understand and even more unimaginable. The existence that built this transmission formation is countless times stronger than me. At this moment, the two of them thought at almost the same time. The two of them looked at each other and saw the same thoughts in each other's eyes. For a moment, their feelings became inexplicably complicated. "You guys wait here. When there are enough people, the transmission formation will be activated and you can leave." Several soldiers who were guarding the transmission formation said faintly when they saw the two cultivators. The two cultivators nodded indifferently. Anyway, everything now depended on the arrangements of others, so they naturally could only accept. However, it was clear that they had yet to properly understand themselves after entering the third level. They had yet to comprehend their own powers in detail. Now, taking advantage of this opportunity, they directly sat cross-legged on the edge of the transmission formation and began to carefully understand themselves. In fact, both of them still had a kind of fluke in their hearts. Perhaps they were the 10,000 cultivators among the tens of billions of cultivators. After thoroughly investigating the situation inside their bodies, they found that everything inside their bodies was actually not under any restrictions, nor did they encounter any shackles. the power inside their bodies, the strength of their bodies, the essence of their lives, and everything else were actually no different from the second level of the Tao Master's path. Because of the tempering in the process of ascending, they were even stronger than when they were in the second level of the Tao Master's path. However, all the power could not shake the outside world at all, and could not change the outside world in the slightest. Even the slightest extraordinary effect could not be exerted. It was as if all their power were in a completely different dimension from this world and their bodies, and there was no connection between them at all. This situation was so absolute that they could not even find the existence of any shackles, let alone the role of the rules that restricted them. If they could not even find the shackles or the role of the rules, it was naturally even more impossible for them to break through. After trying hard to sense for a long time, when the number of people around gradually increased, when the transmission formation was opened, and when the people gradually gathered, the two of them were already covered in cold sweat, and their auras all over their bodies produced a strong agitation. Of course, at this time, the agitation of this aura could not even affect the outside world, and even the people in the outside world could not detect a trace of it. Okay, everyone is here. Everyone, step into the transmission formation and get ready to leave. At this time, the voice of the soldier directly woke the two cultivators up. They opened their eyes and saw that there were already nearly 100 cultivators not far away from them. Among these cultivators, 70 to 80% of these cultivators closed their eyes and cultivated according to their own way, either sitting cross-legged, lying on their sides, or even standing upside down, and even touching the ground with their heads. When Changren woke up, the others also woke up one after another. At this time, their performance was not much better than that of the two cultivators. In fact, some of them performed much worse than the two of them. Pale faces appeared on the faces of the cultivators at this level, and everyone's eyes were filled with irritation, shock, and helplessness. There is no point of strength at all. With this kind of shackles, how on earth did they regain extraordinary power? At this time, this thought appeared in the minds of almost all the cultivators. Each of them looked at the soldiers who obviously had extraordinary power, their faces full of shock and uncertainty. There was a strong desire to explore in the depths of their eyes. Originally, when they had not carefully studied the shackles of the third level of the Tao Master's Road, they did not have a clear idea of the extraordinary power that others had. Although they knew it was not easy, they did not think it was a great achievement. However, it was not until now that they had truly investigated the shackles that they had suffered that they realized how unbelievable it was to cultivate the extraordinary power on the third level. Based on their knowledge and understanding of this shackle, they could not even think of a way to cultivate the extraordinary power. Perhaps it's not unacceptable to mine for 10,000 years in exchange for the cultivation method of extraordinary power. At this moment, such thoughts involuntarily appeared in everyone's minds. Looking at the changes in the expressions of the many cultivators, none of the surrounding soldiers guarding the teleportation formation changed their expressions. After all, they had seen this kind of change in mentality too many times. Almost every cultivator who had ascended before the teleportation formation had a similar performance as this group of cultivators. Even when they first ascended, their own performance was not much different from these cultivators. Although the emotions of the many cultivators changed drastically, they were after all outstanding 3 tribulation experts, and at this time, this change in mentality did not affect their actions. During this process, they stepped into the teleportation formation one by one and stood on the teleportation point. As all the cultivators entered, the soldiers checked the teleportation formation, nodded, and began to activate the teleportation formation according to the activation method. Waves of extraordinary power were injected into the teleportation formation in a variety of subtle and mysterious ways. The runes, talismans, lines, and patterns in the teleportation formation began to flow continuously, gradually making the entire teleportation formation brighter. During this process, the endless space in the surroundings began to tremble, distort, and make a buzzing sound. In the end, when the array was activated to a certain limit, a beam of light shot into the sky, and tore through the void. It was like a huge pillar that shot into the sky. Chapter 21:17. After the third level of the Tao Master's Path was reintegrated, the state of the entire third level had actually undergone earth-shaking changes. Because it had become complete, the types and quantity of resources within it had increased exponentially compared to before. Almost every moment, new resources were being discovered, and new characteristics of certain resources were being discovered. Minerals were one of the resources that had just been discovered in the past hundreds of thousands of years. Because of the reincarnation and sedimentation of the endless world, the third level of the Tao Master's Path had accumulated an endless accumulation of various world wreckages. The aggregates of world wreckages were divided into many different types because of the different aggregated worlds, the different degrees of completeness of the remnants, and the different ways of combining them. Because the structure of these world wreckages was different from that of ordinary materials, because there was no complete world inside, the power and resources in it were in a static state, but it was countless times easier to use than other materials. Moreover, because of the different structural combinations of different world wreckages, there were various mysterious characteristics on these aggregates of world wreckages. These were obviously regarded as minerals by the cultivators in the third level of the Tao Master's Path. If this kind of mineral was in another world, no matter how deep it was buried, any cultivator who could enter the Tao Master's Path could easily dig it out completely. Even if they searched the entire world, they would not miss a single thing. However, the third level of the Tao Master's Path was obviously completely different. Here, the cultivators themselves were still the same. The cultivation realm they should have was still the same cultivation realm, and the power they should have was still the same power. But unless they mastered the extraordinary power of the third level of the Tao Master's Path, they would not be able to exert a trace of it. Under such circumstances, the situation in the incomparably vast third level of the Tao Master's Path had become not much different from an ordinary world. In such a place, the existence with extraordinary power had obviously become a noble existence that could overpower many other ordinary cultivators and ordinary creatures. In addition, such existences had limited extraordinary power. Even if they personally went to mine, their efficiency would only be a few times higher than ordinary creatures. Under such circumstances, it was needless to say what kind of system the third level of the Tao Master would have. At this moment, the 100 cultivators were sent to a mining area somewhere in the world by the teleportation formation. This mining area was located in an extremely remote area on the third level of the Tao Master's Path. Looking out in all directions, there was no sign of human habitation within a radius of billions of miles. Apart from the mine, and the related buildings, there were no traces of civilization, let alone any man-made traces. It felt as if this place had been completely separated from the outside world. Coming to this place was no different from being exiled. When the cultivators arrived, they were at a loss. They looked around and felt that everything was new and unfamiliar. The beastly roars coming from afar and the commotion caused by the various giant creatures made them realize just how dangerous this place was. I didn't think we would feel this powerless again. One of the cultivators sighed, an inexplicable look of helplessness on his face. Don't grieve over the changing seasons anymore. Come out quickly, get the tools and go to the mine. At this moment, a rough roar was heard. Immediately afterward, a huge figure appeared next to the teleportation formation, exuding an extremely powerful aura that made the cultivators tremble uncontrollably. Damn it, I can't even bear such a weak aura. At this moment, the cultivators were all secretly angry. In their eyes, the aura emitted by the burly man was insignificant. In fact, when they were in the itinerant immortal realm, they could easily use their auras to crush this aura thousands of times. It even transmitted back to the burly man, directly crushing his spirit. But now this clearly weak aura, their bodies, their minds, were actually unable to withstand it. The moment they came into contact with this aura, they felt as if their entire body was about to collapse. Don't be emotional. Come out quickly. The big man could not help but roar when he saw the expressions of the cultivators fluctuating. He had worked in this mine for tens of thousands of years and had seen countless new people. Naturally, he could tell what the cultivators were thinking at this moment and knew what they were conflicted about. The cultivators frowned. However, the situation was not in their favor. Since they had been teleported here and had been registered, they could only listen to orders. However, deep down, they were determined to create a cultivation method for extraordinary power as soon as possible. They had to cultivate extraordinary power as soon as possible. Just as they left the teleportation array shone brightly and nearly 100 cultivators appeared. The rough man frowned and ignored them. He chased the cultivators who had just left the teleportation formation like ducks and said, "Hurry up, can't you see that you're blocking the way?" At this moment, they finally saw the situation around the teleportation formation. The area around the teleportation formation was not as empty as it seemed. In fact, it was quite lively. This place looked like a small town. There was a square next to it, and there were thousands of people gathered in groups. There were about 100 people in each team, and among them, there was a man who looked much stronger than the others, who was lecturing them. Although the strength of the cultivators here was sealed and could not be used at all, their consciousness was still there. At this moment, they could roughly guess the situation here at a glance. Obviously, every group of cultivators coming out of the teleportation formation was led by someone. If they were led by someone, they would follow that person into the mine and be considered someone subordinate. According to the situation in the square, the extraordinaires should be taking turns to lead the newcomers who had just come in. As for what the sequence was, it was obviously not something that could be determined at a glance. The big man led them to a corner of the square and said to them, "My name is Tai Zhang. You can call me Tai too. From today onwards, all of you are my subordinates. I will lead you into the mine, supervise your work, and count your contributions. I know you have a lot of doubts, and even a lot of unwillingness. It doesn't matter. We are all experienced people. How you are now is how we were in the past. As long as you work hard in the mine, you will be able to make a name for yourselves one day. All right, enough nonsense. Anyway, you are all smart people, so you should be able to see the situation clearly. Now, follow me to get your tools." The big man changed the topic and said directly. While speaking, he had already led the many cultivators away from the square. Among the many teams on the square, the one who had given the shortest lecture was obviously Tai Zhang, who called himself Tai too. When they had just arrived, there was a team next to them that had already been training for a long time. But when they left, that team still had not finished training. Many cultivators were quite satisfied with this straightforward style. They didn't know anything else, but this method of saving time was naturally good for them. There was naturally nothing much to say about getting their tools. Under Tai Tu's lead, each of them received an iron pickaxe, a cosmos bag, and a description of the mine. After that, they were directly thrown into a small mine under a bare mountain. Your task is to obtain 30 pieces of boundary iron or 1 piece of fine boundary iron every day. No matter what method you use, even if you're just sleeping, as long as you can give me the task item every night, I will not care about you. Tai Zhang said directly to them and completely ignored them. At this time, many cultivators entered the mine, but they were not in the mood to mine at all. Instead, they all carefully read the description of the mine. There were descriptions of all kinds of minerals, such as boundary iron, fine boundary iron, boundary copper, boundary jade, and so on. The descriptions were quite clear. Even the characteristics of the various minerals and their magical effects were clearly described. According to the description, any of these minerals could help the third level of the Dao Master's path to extraordinary power cultivation. However, to use these minerals, only cultivators who had cultivated extraordinary power could do it. I didn't expect there to be such a wonderful mineral. From the description, it seems to have some charm of the third level. A cultivator sighed at this time. Without extraordinary power, we are just at the bottom. Even if this world is magical, what's the use? Another cultivator said faintly. He didn't mention what punishment there would be for not completing the task, right? At this time, suddenly a cultivator said. Hearing this, the other cultivators were silent. Is there a need to mention this punishment? At this time, a very quiet cultivator suddenly said, "Does Taoist fellow know what punishment it is?" Another cultivator asked. His words were asking for advice, but also a kind of questioning. After all, he didn't mention what punishment his leader, Taizhong, said. He said that this is a daily task, so if you don't complete the task, that day naturally doesn't count. The silent cultivator said faintly. Hearing this, all the cultivators were shocked. Suddenly, they all came to a sudden realization. It turned out that things were so simple. For them, the goal of mining was to survive for 10,000 years. When the time was up, they would naturally be able to obtain the extraordinary power cultivation method. Under such circumstances, if a day didn't count, it meant that they had to endure for one more day, which meant that the time to obtain the extraordinary power cultivation method would be delayed by one day. For them, this was already the biggest punishment. Why would there be a need to specially set up other punishments? Of course, if the cultivators had absolute confidence that they could create their own cultivation method, they could naturally completely ignore this punishment. After all, such cultivators simply didn't care about the cultivation method that they could obtain after 10,000 years. However, it was obvious that even if many of the cultivators here wanted to get lucky and faintly hoped that they could create their own cultivation method and comprehend the extraordinary power cultivation method in the third level of the Tao Master's path, they still knew that the probability of this was really not high. Therefore, none of them pinned their hopes on this, and naturally, none of them jumped out to say that this punishment was completely meaningless to them. At this moment, the mind fell into silence. Only the sound of many cultivators constantly flipping through and memorizing the mineral manual occasionally sounded. Although the strength of the cultivators here was like that of an ordinary person, they were after all experts of the three tribulations. Something like having a photographic memory was simply an ability for them. Therefore, soon, this manual of hundreds of thousands of words had been completely memorized by them. Immediately, the cultivators took iron pickaxes and drilled into the depths of the mine, and the sound of mining constantly came from the depths of the mine. What happened in this mine was almost the same as what happened in other mines. Moreover, in the entire third level of the Tao Master's path, there were countless mines similar to this one. That was to say, at every moment, there were countless cultivators forced to do mining work. In each mining area, there were a considerable number of extraordinary powers that controlled the entire mining area. They managed the work of many newcomers. Almost all the mining areas in each area would be merged in one place and unified under a certain management organization. The various management organizations were also unified under a higher level of organization. In this way, it advanced layer by layer until finally, at the top, it was the boy who had directly forced the third senior brother into the Tao Master's prison. Although this boy's appearance seemed to be no different from hundreds of thousands of years ago, but the temperament he exuded was already a world of difference from before. At that time, although his temperament was quite extraordinary, after all, he was just like a lone hero. Even if he was full of sharpness and contained tenacity, after all, he still lacked some support, giving people a feeling that it would not be too difficult to shake him. But now, in just a short period of hundreds of thousands of years, the feeling he gave people was completely different. Now, the first impression that he gave people was that he was stable, incomparably stable, more stable than anything. He sat on the high platform, as if countless worlds had gathered together to form his body. Every move, every breath, seemed to be able to cause drastic changes in the world and produce earth-shattering consequences. At this time, the boy seemed to be just sitting there quietly, but his perception had already spread to the entire third level of the Tao Master's path. It could be said that every mining area, every ascension point, and every organization that had been set up in this world over the past hundreds of thousands of years were his tentacles. They guided his senses beyond his own limits and spread to every area of the third level of the Tao Master's path, so that he could have a clear picture of everything in this world. On this day, the boy sitting on the high platform suddenly frowned and slowly opened his eyes that had been closed for hundreds of thousands of years. There was an inexplicable surprise in his eyes. Where is he? Why can't I find any trace of him, even after searching everywhere? At this time, such a thought flashed through his mind. With this thought in mind, his brows furrowed even more. The person he was thinking of was none other than Luo Fan. In fact, since the establishment of the entire third level of the Town Master's Path, he had been looking for Luo Fan. He did not have any direct purpose, nor did he want to deal with Luo Fan. He just felt that he was unfathomable and wanted to get to know him again under the circumstances. However, the development of things was beyond his expectations. Even if his tentacles had spread throughout the entire third level of the Town Master's Path, even if he had sensed every inch of the space-time range that far exceeded any great world, he still could not find any trace of Luo Fan's existence. It was as if there had never been an expert like Luo Fan in the third level of the Town Master's Path. He can't have ascended. If he has, I will definitely feel it. Before a certain idea emerged in his mind, he instantly extinguished it and repeated the refutation in his heart that he had repeated countless times over the years. At this time, the original conspirator sent a voice transmission. Reporting to the ruler, I found a cultivator who has a karmic connection with him. If you want to find that person, maybe this person can be of some help. The voice was transmitted directly to the boy's ears, causing him to be slightly startled. You really found someone who has a karmic connection with him? At this moment, he could not help but repeat the sentence. This kind of low-standard behavior appeared from an expert who had become the ruler of the third level of the Town Master's Path. It was enough to show how excited he was at this time. Chapter 21:18. Is that him? The boy looked at the old man that appeared in the light and shadow in front of him with a strange expression. Phone. Quick update, please, search. At this moment, the conspirator was already standing next to the boy. He looked at the light and nodded affirmatively. Yes, it's him. After I saw this person, I inadvertently deduced and found out that the karma connection between this person and that person surpasses all existences in the third level. Hearing this, the boy nodded and was slightly moved. All kinds of mysterious information gradually flowed through his mind. As the endless information flowed through, the old man in the light and shadow gradually disappeared in his eyes and was replaced by a mass of tangled karma nodes. The tangled karma nodes were complicated, obscure, and incomparably stubborn. Just like fate, karma was also layered. For ordinary cultivators, when they reached the safe-to-be realm, they could gradually break free from the first level of karma. However, after that, they would enter a deeper level of the long river of fate and continue to be controlled by fate and influenced by fate. Similarly, in the safe-to-be realm, cultivators seem to be able to cut off karma, even manipulate karma, and reverse karma. However, that was obviously only the first level of karma, when they could control, manipulate, and even reverse the moral karma that they could sense at that level. They had actually entered a deeper level of karma entanglement. Like this, they cut off layer by layer and went deeper layer by layer endlessly. Therefore, although the cultivators on the Tao Master Path were all-powerful existences that surpassed the Supreme Emperor realm, there was also karma between them. However, there was also karma between them, and they were similarly affected by karma. They were similarly entangled by karma and could not escape from it. It was also because of this that it was meaningful to talk about karma and opportunities in the Tao Master Path. Of course, although it was a deeper level of karma. However, this could only be seen through in the eyes of those who had reached a high level of cultivation. In the eyes of ordinary cultivators, even those who were entangled by karma, it was impossible for them to sense karma clearly. After all, for existences at their level, anything that they could see could usually be dealt with. If they could see the karma on themselves, they would naturally be able to think of various solutions. No matter how difficult it was, even if it was thousands of times more troublesome than creating a world, they would definitely be able to think of a way to resolve it. Therefore, it could be said that the karma that had yet to be resolved and still existed with the cultivator was actually at least one level deeper than the cultivator himself. In other words, it was karma that cultivators couldn't see and could only faintly sense. Just like at this moment, in the boy's eyes, the old man's karmic entanglement was as chaotic as a tangled mess. But in his own eyes, he did not feel the existence of such karma at all. In his senses, his entire body was clear like glass. There was no karma entanglement, no luck Tao controlling him, and no fate affecting him. The boy was able to see these karma because his cultivation level was much higher than the old man's. More importantly, he was the ruler of the third level of the Tao Sovereign's Path. In the third level of the Tao Sovereign's Path, he could possess unimaginably supreme power. This supreme power was enough to allow him to see through everything and see things that he could not see in the past. For example, the endless karma entangled with the old man. Among the endless karma on the old man, some were the karma of the past, some were the karma of the future, and some were the karma of the present. The numerous karma mixed together in a way that normal living beings could not imagine and entangled with the old man. They either shackled him, protected him, hindered him, or provided him with motivation. Amidst the endless karma, there was a karma that was extremely strange. It seemed to come from the past, but it also seemed to come from the future, and it also seemed to come from the present. Above this karma, the past, the present, and the future had reached an unimaginable balance. This unimaginable balance made the effect of the karma on the old man seem completely different from ordinary karma. It seemed to be protecting the old man, providing him with a strong motivation to move forward, but also seemed to be shackling him, making him move forward as if he was shackled. Every step forward seemed to leave a pool of blood on the ground. The boy's power in the third level of the Tao Sovereign's Path was much stronger than that of the conspirator. Even the conspirator was able to use various methods to find out that the old man had a karmic connection with Luo Fan. How could he not discover that the strange karmic connection was the karmic connection between him and Luo Fan? There really is a huge karma. The boy murmured at this moment, with an awe-inspiring smile on his face. For him, the karma was equivalent to catching a trace of Luo Fan's existence. In other words, it was only a matter of time before he found Luo Fan. At this moment, his heart moved slightly. He raised his hand and stretched out, grabbing at the phantom of the old man. At that instant, a shocking giant hand suddenly appeared in the shadow. This giant hand appeared out of nowhere in the sky. After it appeared, it quickly descended and gradually pressed down on the old man. In a short while, it had already come to the side of the old man and directly pinched him in its hand. At this time, the old man had actually cultivated the extraordinary power of the Tao Sovereign's Path. Even this extraordinary power was not inferior to that of ordinary rogue cultivators. In fact, in the third level of the Tao Sovereign's Path, he could actually be called an expert. However, in the face of the hand formed by the boy, the old man was unable to resist at all. He could only watch as the hand approached, and the two giant fingers directly pinched him. With a shake, all his resistance was completely shattered, turning him into an existence more fragile than a baby. He was easily lifted from where he was. Which expert is joking with me? The old man shouted in horror at this moment. Of course, such a shout would not receive any reply. At this moment, the boy shrunk his hand, and the hand that appeared in the light screen, along with the old man within it, disappeared within the light screen. At the same time, in the void in front of the boy, a giant hand appeared out of thin air. In between the two fingers of the hand was an old man who was constantly trembling and struggling. At this moment, the shadow of the hand shook slightly and disappeared into thin air. The old man's almost futile struggle instantly erupted with an earth-shattering effect. As he struggled, the surrounding air seemed to be stuffed with countless bombs and exploded crazily, producing loud, rumbling sounds. Although the nomological laws did not fully appear because of this, they vividly displayed the fact that they existed through the various phenomena. After struggling for a while, he found that the hand had disappeared, and he could not help but be at a loss. However, after all, he was a powerful existence who relied on his own ability to step into the third level of the Tao Sovereign's Path. At this moment, he quickly noticed the platform, as well as the boy and the conspirator on it. The moment he saw them, the old man asked, "Who are you?" At the same time, power surged in his body, and his vigilant posture could not be more obvious. At this moment, in the face of such a change, the boy smiled faintly and said, "You don't need to know who we are. I have a use for something on you." As he spoke, the boy raised his hand and stretched it out. In an instant, a ray of light directly appeared around the old man's body and rushed towards him. It had already rushed into the old man's body. The old man's strength was very strong, and he was definitely not weaker than an ordinary cultivator who had stepped into the third level of the Tao Sovereign's path. However, the time he had spent cultivating the extraordinary power of the third level of the Tao Sovereign's path was too short. Until now, he had only cultivated the extraordinary power to the level of an itinerant immortal. In other words, in the third level of the Tao Sovereign's path, he was actually only equivalent to an itinerant immortal cultivator. In this way, how could he possibly struggle against the boy, who had become the ruler of the third level of the Tao Sovereign's path and controlled the entire third level of the Tao Sovereign's path? At this moment, he could only watch helplessly as the light rushed into his body and suddenly brought out something invisible and intangible. But he felt that it was a wondrous existence that was incomparably important to him. What the hell did you take away? At this moment, an inexplicable fear emerged from the bottom of his heart, and he could not help but exclaim, "It's just a karma. I don't think it's too precious to you." The boy actually answered the old man's question at this moment. This unusual behavior clearly showed how wonderful his mood was at this moment. He could not help but be in a wonderful mood. After all, this meant that his hundreds of thousands of years of pursuit had finally come to fruition. No, although he did not know what kind of karma it was, the old man instinctively felt that if this karma was really taken away, it would have an unprecedented impact on him. It would even be enough to affect his life. With this understanding, one could imagine how intense his reaction was. At this moment, he roared and the power in his body surged. Countless rays of spiritual light scattered, and powerful, extraordinary power erupted from him as he directly grabbed the thing that was gradually leaving him. It was a pity that courage and determination were clearly not enough to represent power. Even though the old man was so determined, even though he was willing to sacrifice all the extraordinary power he had obtained over the past few days, in the end, the effect produced was so insignificant. He could only watch as the light shook slightly and shattered the extraordinary power that he had given everything and sacrificed everything to release that exceeded his normal power by thousands of times. Immediately afterwards, he could only watch as the light brought the formless object and the formless existence back to the platform in front of him. As expected, my senses were correct. At this moment, the boy touched the invisible existence with a faint smile on his face. At this moment, he no longer had any interest in even glancing at the old man. Even though the old man had sacrificed everything just now to display an action that could destroy his means, it was not enough to change his actions. At this moment, facing this change, the schemer said, "Congratulations, ruler." The boy laughed and said, "Let me catch him first before you congratulate me. It's been hundreds of thousands of years. Let me see where you have been hiding for these hundreds of thousands of years." At this moment, an indifferent voice rang out in everyone's ears. "So it's here. I was wondering why my karma would be touched." This voice contained an extremely indifferent charm, causing the boy's expression to involuntarily change, and the schemer could not help but feel inexplicable fear in his heart. As for the other old man, there was an inexplicable look of surprise on his face. It's been hundreds of billions of years. I finally hear this voice again. Such a thought flashed in his mind at this moment. "I didn't expect you to enter the third level, Taoist friend. May I know how much time has passed since we last met?" At this moment, a seemingly illusory figure appeared beside the old man and smiled at the old man. This illusory figure was none other than Luo Fan. And this old man was none other than the old man who gave Luo Fan pointers when he first entered the Tao Master Path for the second time. At that time, he felt that there was an inexplicable connection between him and the old man, but he did not expect that this connection would actually be confirmed today, and here Hearing Luo Fan's words, the old man sighed and said, Taoist friend, you only know me now, but I've already known about you for a long time. Whether it's the first or the second level, you have left quite a lot of legends. 3 trillion years have passed since the last time I met you, fellow Taoist. 300 trillion years. Even though he had already expected this, when he heard that so much time had passed, Luo Fan was still slightly stunned. So much time has passed. It seems that my previous guess was correct. The Tao Master Path can indeed connect the past, the present, and the future. Finally, he sighed, and his expression showed a sense of relief as if his doubts had been answered. Have you guys talked enough? At this time, the boy finally interrupted. May I know why you're looking for me? Luo Fan sighed at this time and looked at the boy with a somewhat puzzled and dissatisfied expression. He did not have any deep hatred with the boy, and even the conflict of interest was completely unrelated. Under such circumstances, he didn't know what to say between them. The boy actually made such a big movement to find him and even directly attacked the expert who had some karmic connection with him. If you want to talk about something big, of course not. However, there are still some small matters. The boy said at this time with a faint expression. Hearing this, Luo Fan became curious and asked, What small matters? Oh, and since I have already appeared, then return the karmic connection to this Taoism friend of mine. When the boy heard this, he smiled faintly. He did not have any intention of using the old man to threaten him. He sent the invisible karmic connection directly into the old man's body and reintegrated into the old man's karmic node. At this moment, the old man felt an inexplicable sense of clarity emerging from the bottom of his heart. The subtle panic that arose from the removal of the invisible existence completely disappeared without a trace. Luo Fan's heart moved, and with a wave of his hand, a strange phantom was sent into the arms of the old man. Immediately afterward, the old man's body shook slightly and gradually became illusory. In the blink of an eye, he had disappeared without a trace, as if he had never appeared. Huh, he also disappeared? It seems that Taoism friend's ability is really beyond my expectations. You can even hide from others. The boy frowned at this time and said with some displeasure. The reason why he was so eager to find Luo Fan was because Luo Fan had used some unknown means to avoid his search. But now, right in front of him, this cultivator in front of him did not give him any face and hid others from him. How could he be happy about this? With this precedent, it is hard to believe that Taoism friend won't come again. At this time, Luo Fan just said at this time. The boy frowned, but soon put it down and said, It seems that Taoism friend is quite confident in your means. Then let me see how you can directly leave and hide in front of me. As he spoke, he snorted coldly, and a subtle vibration appeared on the entire third level of the Tao Master's path. This vibration was so mysterious and so incredible. In this vibration, all living beings faintly felt a kind of anger emerging in their hearts, and faintly had an impulse to completely destroy everything in front of them. Of course, this impulse was, after all, just an impulse. After the vibration disappeared, it completely disappeared. Even the slightest trace could be left. At this time, in this place where the boy and Luo Fan were, there had been an earth-shattering change. Chapter 21:19. Everything in this area had been replaced by quakes. Even the fundamental rules of the third level of the Tao Master's path had been replaced by quakes by the boy, who was the ruler of the third level of the Tao Master's path. It could be said that this quaking world was completely an extension of the boy's own power. Everything here could be said to be within his domain. In the face of this change, Luo Fan felt some kind of powerful and unparalleled pressure coming from all directions. It was constantly crushing him, trying to completely crush the essence of his existence. At this time, in the face of such a change, Luo Fan frowned and said, This method is a little crude. At this moment, rays of light were suddenly released from his body. They condensed in the void and turned into a huge palm. The palm pointed forward and gently poked forward. In an instant, the fluctuating ocean began to shake violently. Faintly, there seemed to be traces of cracks appearing from the depths of this area. They gradually spread and appeared as if they were going to completely tear this area apart. In the face of such a change, the boy's eyes revealed a kind of excitement. Although the method that Luo Fan displayed in front of him was powerful, it was not incomprehensible to him. At this time, a light and shadow swept across the fluctuating ocean that spanned hundreds of millions of miles, directly adding a strange light and shadow to the fluctuating ocean. This light and shadow was so mysterious and incredible that one could faintly see the endless, wonderful world superimposed in one place. There were countless living beings living and fighting in all sorts of special or ordinary ways. As the light and shadow shrouded the area, Luo Fan's finger that was condensed from numerous concept divine abilities seemed to have fallen into an illusion. It seemed to be on a completely different level from the surrounding world, a different dimension. No matter how strong his attack was, it seemed to be difficult for it to come into contact with the slightest bit of this fluctuating ocean. The charm of the collapse caused by this finger naturally disappeared at this moment. At this moment, the fluctuation and the illusory light and shadow began to gradually merge. Not long after, the two completely fused into one. In the end, the light and shadow completely turned into a mysterious thing. It was as if a wonderful, illusory space-time had descended into reality, directly replacing the space-time within a radius of billions of miles. At this moment, Luo Fan sensed all sorts of incomprehensible powers seeping into his body. A feeling of being constantly probed, researched, and even controlled gradually emerged from the bottom of his heart. In the face of such a drastic change, he coldly snorted, and the worldview of laws in his body trembled. It emerged and turned into a phantom that shrouded his body. From the looks of it, the world of laws looked quite different from before. Now, there was still a difference in brightness on the surface of this worldview, but it was no longer as obvious as before. The current world looked more like his body, more like his true appearance. With the emergence of this worldview of laws, the power that was constantly seeping into his body was instantly shattered by him. So, it's this kind of power. As the worldview of laws twisted that power, Luo Fan roughly understood what that power was in a trance. That power was none other than a type of power that surpassed the power of concept divine abilities that were condensed and brewed together by many concept divine abilities. This power was invisible and intangible, but had infinite penetrative power and contained all sorts of unimaginable power. If he had really been penetrated by that power just now, then he might have been completely assimilated by that power and pulled into the depths of that power, becoming an existence that he had never thought of before. This is a further change in concept god arts. At this moment, Luo Fan was already certain of this. This power came from the perception god art, yet it surpassed the perception god art. It also contained a lot of power that was extracted and sublimated from the perception god art. If he still didn't know the development direction of the perception god art, then he would have cultivated to this level for nothing. At this moment, the expression in Luo Fan's eyes also changed slightly. An inexplicable excitement also appeared in the depths of his eyes. I didn't expect to come out on a whim and gain such a huge harvest. To him, everything else was secondary. Even the karma between him and the old man had fallen to an insignificant level. To him, what was really important was the information that he could obtain from the boy. The boy's expression changed slightly at this moment. Originally, the cultivator in front of him appeared to be very calm. Even when the boy attacked him directly, he seemed to be more helpless and didn't have any battle intent at all. However, at this moment, for some reason, the other party's battle intent surged. The battle intent that soared into the sky even burned the boy like flames. He frowned and said, "You seem to have the will to fight already." Whether Luo Fan had the will to fight or not didn't affect him too much. After all, the two of them were currently fighting. Whether the other party had the will to fight or not wouldn't change the fact that they were fighting. In fact, whether the other party had the will to fight or not wouldn't have much of an effect on the other party's strength. It wouldn't affect the outcome of the battle much either. However, What he was concerned about was the appearance of this will to fight. It was too difficult to understand. He couldn't understand why this will to fight would appear at all. What exactly happened that he couldn't understand at all? In the midst of a battle, something unexpected happened. This itself meant that there was a problem with his ability to control the battle. Naturally, it would affect the outcome of the battle, of course. Since fellow Taoist has shown such ability, how can I remain indifferent? Luo Fan just faintly smiled. Then with a thought, the palm that was formed by countless concept god arts shook slightly. Then it suddenly split and turned into two smaller palms. After these two smaller palms appeared, they began to change hand seals in the void. Every change of these hand seals triggered supreme power and stirred up the surrounding space-time. Even the mystical illusory worlds in the surroundings began to be affected during this process. Waves of ripples were continuously transmitted in all directions. This illusory world was formed by billions of illusory worlds stacked together. At this moment, the layers of illusory worlds were constantly stirred up by the hand seals formed by Luo Fan's concept god arts. The layers of illusory worlds kept collapsing as if they were being penetrated by the hand seals. At this moment, the boy saw that something was wrong. He shouted loudly and waved his hand, causing the illusory space-time to fluctuate violently. Countless illusory creatures continuously gathered towards where Luo Fan was from the various layers of illusory worlds. They kept attacking the hand within the layers of illusory space-time. In Luo Fan's opinion, the strength of these illusory creatures was simply insignificant. If it was in the normal space-time, even if there were billions of such creatures, he could easily wipe them out with a finger. However, at this moment, the situation was obviously completely different in this environment. This was because these creatures were currently in layers of illusory space-time. Based on the endless layers of illusory space-time, even if only one creature attacked him in thousands of layers, the number of creatures attacking him would still be calculated in billions of trillions. Moreover, although the attacks of these creatures were illusory, they all contained a kind of power that could switch between illusory and real. Every time an attack landed on the palm formed by the concept god arts, he felt that the palm seemed to be going through an illusory transition from the original real to the illusory. Facing such an attack, even Luo Fan couldn't help but feel that it was a little troublesome. At this moment, he raised his hand and waved. Countless concept god arts were released from his body and turned into endless light that poured into the two palms. After hundreds of thousands of years of cultivation, he had almost completely developed all the concepts in his worldview into concept god arts. And with the help of the concept god arts and the reaction between his concepts, every concept in his worldview had made great progress compared to before. It could be said that the current Luo Fan was many times stronger than he was hundreds of thousands of years ago. If he encountered the clone of his third senior brother and the others again, he definitely wouldn't be entangled with them to such an extent. Perhaps he would be able to completely annihilate them with a single thought. At this moment, the effect of Luo Fan's attack could be said to be immediate. Countless heavens and earth were released from the palm, formed by the concept divine ability, and blasted into the layers of the illusory world, directly filling up the illusory world. It continued to spread and expand, filling up more and more layers of the illusory world and changing them. This kind of response was clearly beyond the boy's expectations. At this moment, he frowned and let out a soft roar. Countless light surged out from the back of his head and condensed into illusory worlds that constantly fused with the surrounding illusory space-time, causing the illusory space-time to continuously strengthen and expand. The countless worlds created by Luo Fan's concept god arts were under more and more pressure during this process. The expansion suddenly stopped. Although it didn't immediately fall back, it could no longer grow endlessly like before. The boy took advantage of this opportunity and let out a roar. The countless illusory worlds suddenly fused together, and a strange illusory world that surpassed all of the previous illusory worlds appeared beside him. As soon as this illusory world appeared, Luo Fan's face suddenly shook. I was right. He actually managed to condense a concept god art to such a degree. In his eyes, the illusory world that had just appeared was not an ordinary illusory world. Instead, it was a mysterious existence that was continuously condensed and combined by a huge amount of concept god arts. In the depths of that mysterious existence, what dominated it was the power that kept invading his body and wanted to completely control his body. In his opinion, that power was the direction of the development of concept god arts, the direction of sublimation. However, compared to the power that he had easily dealt with before, the power contained in the illusory world was countless times stronger and denser. The difference between the two could even be compared to the difference between a firefly and the sun. After the illusory world took shape, Luo Fan felt that the illusory world around him had suddenly strengthened by countless times. A terrifying power that was countless times stronger than before was released from it. It kept acting on his body, trying to penetrate his worldview and penetrate deep into his body. Due to the sudden strengthening, the concept god art that was originally on par with him suddenly trembled. It could no longer maintain its state of stalemate and began to retreat bit by bit. The numerous worlds that were released from the concept god art were constantly being crushed during this process. They kept rolling back and turning into waves that constantly slapped against the two palms that were condensed from the concept god art. They directly scattered the hand seals that the two palms were constantly forming, causing the two palms to gradually retreat. It looked like they were about to collide with Luo Fan's body. It's really powerful. Faced with this change, Luo Fan let out a soft cry. At this moment, the worldview on the surface of his body gradually began to tremble, and rays of light were released from it. The appearance of each ray of light caused some subtle changes to the worldview. It seemed like the original perfect balance was broken, causing the worldview to collapse. It also seemed like the worldview had received some kind of enhancement, some kind of unimaginable growth. Following this change, the boy's expression suddenly changed. What is that? Why does it have the aura of the concept god art? This boy was an itinerant cultivator. Although he had grown many times stronger than the disciples of a Tao master because of many opportunities, he did not have a good background after all. In terms of knowledge, he was still somewhat inferior to the disciples of a truly powerful Tao master. At this moment, he actually could not recognize what was covering the surface of Luo Fan's body. Originally, when he saw the worldview that appeared on the surface of Luo Fan's body, he only thought that it was a special kind of protection god art. Although it was very difficult to understand, it was just like that. Only now, when the existence released the aura of the concept god art, did he suddenly realize that the thing was probably many times more exquisite than he had imagined. It might even be an existence that could subvert his worldview. This kind of indescribable premonition made his mood become agitated. No matter what it is, it doesn't matter to me, who has already prepared everything. In the end, he shouted softly and decided to completely ignore the strange existence. With this roar, the mysterious world that appeared around his body, condensed and transformed by the concept god art, suddenly began to expand wildly. As it expanded, more and more illusory space-times were completely integrated into it, so that it began to strengthen itself with every passing moment. At this time, it looked completely different to the outside world. From the inside, it looked like the illusory space-time was devouring the surroundings, but from the outside, it looked like a hole was gradually emerging where the boy was. This hole became bigger and bigger as time went by. Finally, at a certain moment, it had completely devoured the surroundings, leaving only Luo Fan, who was covered by the worldview god art, still floating there. However, although his body seemed to be empty, there seemed to be some kind of indescribable and terrifying pressure lingering around, looking for his flaws, as if it was going to invade his protective circle at any time. The reason why there was such a change when looking inside and outside was actually very simple. This was because everything inside the illusory space-time, although fundamentally still the third level of the Tao Master's Road, had been covered by the boy's means for a long time after all. In fact, its essence had already undergone some subtle changes, and the original illusory characteristics had gradually emerged in this area. Under such circumstances, if one observed the deeper layer of the illusory in this area, they would naturally be able to see the deeper layer of the illusory entity and see its appearance clearly. It was completely different from the outside world. In the outside world, it was not affected by the illusory space-time. Real laws occupied everything, and things on the illusory level naturally did not exist in the outside world. The illusory space-time that was not too deep, such as the world around Luo Fan, that only had a part of the illusory law, could be seen by the outside world because there was also a part of it that was real. However, the deeper layer of the illusory world created by the boy was different. In that deep layer of the illusory, the real laws had been suppressed to the extreme. Although it was not completely non-existent, its density was no longer something that ordinary cultivators and ordinary creatures could perceive. Therefore, it was naturally difficult for them to see the existence of the illusory space-time. At this time, when he looked over, it was naturally an empty space. Chapter 21:20. At a certain moment, the aura of the concept divine power finally reached a certain limit. A part of the world instantly broke through the restrictions of the world view and frantically expanded in all directions. Compared to the illusory world that the boy had conjured, this world seemed to be countless times worse on the surface. No matter what, the illusory world seemed to be extremely complete. It was even a world born of countless living beings and cultivators. On the other hand, the world released by Luo Fan's concept divine power was completely different. This world seemed to be unimaginably dilapidated. The entire world was so crude that it was indescribable. Although it could barely be considered a world, both the sky and the ground were extremely dilapidated. There was a piece missing here and a corner missing there. The laws here lacked a certain key, and the laws there lacked a certain support. Under such a combination, rather than saying that this world was a world, it would be better to say that it was a piece of chaos. However, it was precisely these two seemingly different worlds that gave off a completely different feeling from what they appear to be on the surface. The more complete, illusory world gave people a sense of threat, but it was far from the dilapidated world released by Luo Fan's concept divine power. The difference between the two couldn't be said to be like the difference between heaven and earth, let alone the difference between heaven and earth. However, it was also big enough to shock anyone. With the appearance of this world, the illusory space-time that seemed to have been completely hidden in the outside world suddenly began to reappear. From the point of contact with Luo Fan's dilapidated and crude world, it constantly spread in all directions. Moreover, from the point of contact, the illusory world continuously collapsed and perished. The space-time structure, the laws, the matter, energy, and everything else were constantly destroyed in the process. They turned into various kinds of smoke and began to spread in all directions at this moment. The expression on the boy's face became extremely unsightly. The conspirator beside the boy was full of disbelief. As a disciple of a Tao master, the conspirator's knowledge was a level higher than that of the boy. In the eyes of the boy, Luo Fan's means were completely strange, but in the eyes of the conspirator, the meaning of this means was enough to make him afraid. He actually went against the flow to this step. I'm afraid that this person really has a chance to become a Tao master. At this moment, such a thought flashed in his mind. With such a thought, his mentality at this time had unknowingly changed. The way he looked at the boy was no longer as completely submissive as before. Vaguely, an inexplicable feeling appeared in his eyes. Originally, the reason why the conspirator was so obedient to the boy was that the boy, as a rogue cultivator, could even suppress all the disciples of the Tao master he knew, and even the 4 senior sisters seemed to be inferior to him. This kind of growth made him feel that this person had a great possibility to become a Tao master. If he attached himself to the boy, his almost slim possibility to become a Tao master would be greatly increased. It was precisely because of such considerations that he was willing to help this boy, and that was why he was so obedient to him. However, at this time, he actually found that there was another rogue cultivator who was even more nature-defying than the boy. Back then, it seemed like he could not compare to this boy. This time around, he had already far surpassed this boy after merely hundreds of thousands of years. The gap between the two of them had even become increasingly large as the number of techniques that both parties had displayed increased. Such a situation made him think again. Did the boy in front of him really have a chance to become a Tao master? In the same cultivation environment, he is actually inferior to others. Can such an existence really become a Tao master? Such a thought flashed in the mind of the boy. Becoming a Tao master was almost the highest achievement for any cultivator. For these Tao masters, although they had seen many more Tao masters than the rogue cultivators, it was precisely because of this that they had a deeper understanding of how powerful a Tao master was and how difficult it was to become a Tao master. Therefore, every disciple of a Tao master knew very well that only by walking to the forefront of cultivators of the same generation and becoming an existence that stood at the peak of all experts of the same generation could one become a Tao master, no matter what identity, no matter who. As long as there was a peer who could surpass you, it meant that it was almost impossible for you to become a Tao master. After all, it could be said that a Tao master had to exhaust all one's potential life and everything in order to achieve the supreme great cause. Such a great cause was hundreds of millions of times more difficult than becoming the strongest expert of any level. But you can't even become the strongest expert of a certain level. How can you make people believe that you can eventually become a Tao master countless times more powerful than becoming the strongest expert of a certain level? This understanding had long been deeply rooted in the conspirator's mind and could no longer be shaken. Because of this thought, the way he looked at Luo Fan had unknowingly changed at this time. Faintly, a kind of idea of how to rely on Luo Fan and how to stand on his side began to emerge in his mind. Regarding the change in the conspirator's mentality, neither the boy nor Luo Fan was in the mood to care at this time. Needless to say, the boy naturally did not need to say much. At this time, Luo Fan's power suddenly increased so much that even he felt that he was powerless to resist. How could he have the time to care about the change in the mood of his subordinate? It was too late to think about how to deal with the opponent's attack. As for Luo Fan, at this time, he felt that there was endless information flowing through his mind from his worldview of laws. From the depths of his heart, there was endless inspiration constantly emerging, constantly changing his understanding of the worldview of laws and changing his understanding of heaven and earth. In this way, where would he have the time and energy to care about other things? At this time, his eyes had become a little dazed and a little dazed. Faintly, specks of light constantly appeared in the bottom of his heart, constantly shining. On the other side, the broken world released by his worldview was constantly squirming and changing as it continued to expand. The scenery of the world was also constantly changing along with this change. Vaguely, every law, every bit of time and space, and every bit of matter and energy were constantly changing in a direction that would make the entire world more complete. The boy showed a look of anger when he saw this scene. He actually dared to gain enlightenment while fighting me. This thought flashed through his mind. While thinking about this, he suddenly raised his hand and slapped in the direction of Luo Fan. With this slap, the endless illusory world turned into earth-shattering waves that surged towards the broken space-time that appeared around Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan felt that the space-time on the surface of his body was under indescribable pressure. The edge of the space-time continued to collapse, turning into countless fragments that surged back towards him. However, it was obvious that this was not enough to completely shatter his space-time. At this moment, in the face of this change, the world around his body began to surge violently, and waves of energy were naturally stimulated from the world. Every part of the originally broken world seemed to be emitting an indescribable brilliance. This brilliance continued to converge towards the damaged part of the world, causing the world to condense and recover once again the moment it was damaged. This brilliance was extremely mysterious, and there was a faint feeling of eternity and indestructibility within it. Following this change, the space-time seemed to be stimulated. Suddenly, small worlds rushed out from the damaged part and rushed in all directions. They were like cannonballs that continuously smashed into the surrounding illusory space-time. As they exploded, more and more of the illusory space-time was destroyed. When the boy saw this, he let out a soft cry. The illusory space-time produced an indescribable fluctuation that poured into the world released by Luo Fan's worldview from all directions. This fluctuation was extremely mysterious and profound. After it affected the world, it began to change the world in an unimaginable way. As it changed, a subtle illusory charm began to radiate from the world. It was just like the illusory space-time itself. Following this change, a real charm began to radiate from somewhere in the illusory space-time. Replace. At this moment, this thought suddenly flashed through Luo Fan's mind. The boy's method was to use some kind of power from the illusory world to directly affect the space-time he had constructed and replace a part of it with another area. This kind of replacement, in essence, did not cause him any harm. The area he could control was still as much as before, and his power was still as strong as before. His power could still be released as before. However, although it did not cause any harm, the impact on the situation of the battle was quite profound. This was because this kind of replacement was clearly allowing the opponent's power to enter deeply into his own power. In other words, it was allowing the opponent to bypass his own defense. This allowed the opponent's power to finally have an effect on him directly. But if it's the other way around, I seem to be able to use the same method. At this moment, Luo Fan had a flash of inspiration and thought to himself. As he thought of this, his heart stirred slightly. As a powerful force surged, the part of the space-time that had been replaced in the depths of the illusory world that contained the real characteristics of the space-time around his body began to quickly condense and change under his control. It didn't take long for a small world to appear in that region. How can it be so fast? At this moment, the boy revealed an indescribable shock and couldn't help but exclaim. Immediately, he manipulated the endless illusory space-time around the newly formed space-time and began to rush towards the small world. Ferocious power was released, and countless illusory creatures were constantly thrown into the small world, causing unprecedented damage to the small world. As expected, this method is effective. At this moment, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. At this moment, he changed his direction. Under his adjustment, the part of the world that had erupted from the damaged area no longer randomly destroyed in all directions. Instead, it directly turned towards the small world that had already set up a base in the depths of the illusory world. Boom, 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 boom. At this moment, earth-shattering booms continuously emerged from the surrounding illusory space-time. The illusory space-time continued to collapse and disappear during this process. A longer and longer passageway led to the small world, and more space-time continued to advance towards the small world. Although every time it advanced, 10 times the size of the world was destroyed in the process, this kind of advancement alone was enough to frighten the boy. Luo Fan's response was so effective that the boy had never seen it before. In the past, he had also used this method to fight with other practitioners. Generally speaking, even the disciples of the Tao Master would find it difficult to take effective measures in the face of this method. Most of the time, they would be completely subdued before they could understand the nature of this method. However, no one had ever been able to do what Luo Fan did. The moment he used this method, Luo Fan was able to grasp the key point. Not only was he not subdued by this method, but he was also able to use this method to attack him. This was the first time this had happened. Even though the boy had already prepared a plan, he was still a little flustered. Damn it! Is this person the reincarnation of a true saint? How can he grasp the key of anything with just a glance? This thought flashed through the boy's mind. Ever since he knew Luo Fan, the Luo Fan that he knew seemed to be like this. Everything, even if it was a concept ability, could be grasped with a single glance. They could even innovate and create some methods and powers that even the original creators like them could not create. Even this method that he had sublimated from the concept divine ability didn't seem to have any secrets in Yishiwen's eyes, and Yishiwen was able to grasp the flaws with just a glance at this moment. He vaguely understood why he didn't choose to use this method to attack Luo Fan from the beginning. Perhaps he had instinctively sensed the danger of overreaching himself by using such a method. Just as these thoughts flashed through his mind, Luo Fan had already taken action again. At this moment, he let out a soft roar and bolts of lightning streaked across the sky and earth released by the world view around him. The moment the lightning streaked across the world, a powerful force suddenly erupted. The laws, power, matter, and space-time in the entire world seemed to have been detonated, instantly releasing unimaginable power that directly overturned the entire world. At this moment, the world became many times more violent than before. The charm of the chaotic state that originally existed in this world also became even more intense during this process. If any living being who had seen the state of chaos saw this world, they would immediately feel the feeling of being incomparably small, while the other party was incomparably huge, which could only be produced when facing the state of chaos. Indeed, this is a divine ability, not a world. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly smiled, and an indescribable sense of enlightenment appeared on his face. As he comprehended this, the lightning in the broken world became more and more numerous, and the power released by everything in the world also began to increase by several times. Along with this change, the crushing force of this world on the illusory world suddenly increased by several times. In an instant, the speed of the world's expansion suddenly increased by more than 10 times. It felt as if the surrounding illusory world had turned into a pile of sand, and as the power of the world rushed against it, it naturally dissipated, unable to form an effective defense. Due to this chaos, the illusory world that had been replaced by the world also couldn't withstand the violent power. During this process, it constantly collapsed and was continuously destroyed. It didn't take long for it to completely disappear. At the same time, a similar change occurred in the small world that had entered deep into the illusory world. The small world suddenly became extremely chaotic, and the aura that belonged to the chaotic state continued to strengthen. The expansion, assimilation, and destruction effects of the world had reached an indescribable level. The surrounding illusory world and illusory space-time couldn't resist at all. They could only retreat under that power, constantly giving up space-time and being replaced by the chaotic space-time. This change affected time and space. Therefore, although it required a process, it was difficult to describe with time. In the eyes of outsiders, in just a flash, the world released by Luo Fan's worldview had already broken through the barrier of the illusory world and gathered in one place again. Moreover, it had completely submerged the platform that the boy was on. At this point, the boy seemed to have completely fallen into the chaotic world released by Luo Fan's worldview. He seemed so small and powerless. Chapter 21:21. All along, according to Luo Fan's understanding, any divine ability or power seemed to be transformed into heaven and earth at the highest level. The only difference was whether the heaven and earth was at a higher or lower level, strong or weak. After all, as far as he knew, the most perfect and powerful existence was the heavens and earth. This understanding could not be said to be wrong. It was just that after reaching his current level, this understanding was obviously no longer perfect. After all, he had already seen many things that were more powerful and more perfect than heaven and earth, for example. The chaotic state was the most typical existence that was more perfect and powerful than heaven and earth. Others, such as the various mysterious magic treasures created by true saints and Tao masters, the Tao master's path, and the fragments of something that surpassed primordial origin spiritual treasures, weren't these all more powerful and more perfect than heaven and earth? Therefore, it could be said that if he still held the attitude that heaven and earth was the most perfect and magnificent, and any divine ability or power would be transformed into heaven and earth at the highest level, it would obviously be a little inappropriate. And this understanding was the root of the change in him just now. What he had displayed was a collection of many concept magical abilities. Originally, he had completely reconstructed it according to the content of the world of laws, hoping to completely transform it into a perfect world of laws. That was why the collection had become such a broken world and such a crude world. However, after he realized that he was out of place, he suddenly understood. Why did he need to transform the collection of many divine abilities into heaven and earth? This was not because he wanted to build a perfect world of laws, but to use it against the enemy. Did it matter whether it was heaven and earth, and whether it had the perfect balance of heaven and earth? As long as he could superimpose and sublimate the power of all the divine abilities, wouldn't it be fine? Did it matter whether it was heaven and earth, and what kind of performance it had? After realizing this, he instantly found that the world in front of him had opened up in an instant. Many of the questions that were entangled in front of him, like a fog, suddenly had answers. After that, he directly changed the structure of the divine abilities, allowing the characteristics of these divine abilities to superimpose and combine with each other. In this way, the originally broken world was transformed into a state of absolute chaos that was similar to the state of primal chaos. It also allowed it to erupt with unimaginable power, easily suppressing the illusory world the boy had set up, and easily suppressing the convergence of the opponent's many concept divine abilities. Naturally, Luo Fan couldn't explain these changes to the boy. At this moment, his heart trembled slightly. The chaos that seemed to be in a state of primal chaos swept out in all directions. In the blink of an eye, it had already completely destroyed the illusory world. As it retracted, it had already wrapped around the boy, leaving him only the size of the platform to move around. "Sovereign, let's retreat," the conspirator said to the boy. "Retreat." The boy was stunned at first. Then, as if his dignity had been offended, he roared in anger. "How can we retreat? I'm the ruler of the third floor. I still have some tricks that I haven't used yet." With this roar, his body trembled, and the entire third floor of the town master's road began to shake. For a time, an unknown amount of mysterious power quickly erupted from all over the third floor, and under the guidance of some extremely mysterious mechanism, it quickly gathered at the place where the platform was at this moment, and quickly poured into the platform. As the endless mysterious power was poured into the platform, it suddenly began to wriggle as if it had suddenly been sublimated. All kinds of indescribable light were constantly released from the platform, colliding with the chaotic power that Luo Fan had displayed, causing an earth-shattering movement. Even space-time and the nomological laws began to shake violently. In the face of such a change, Luo Fan frowned. His heart trembled slightly, and he raised his hand to grab at the void. In an instant, the absolute chaos changed, and a power that was thousands of times stronger than before was triggered, pouring towards the platform. The power of the chaos itself was uncertain. Some chaos might cause the power to decrease, while some chaos might cause the power to increase. And some chaos had an extremely obvious effect on some changes, while others were quite inconspicuous. Even Luo Fan still had no way to clearly control the changes that were going on. Only by waiting for time, waiting for him to become more and more familiar with this method, could he control it. At this time, this chaos was stimulated, its power was triggered, and in turn, it blasted the changes of the platform with a more powerful means. This was formed by the combination of Luo Fan's adjustment and the changes of the chaos itself. His power was unparalleled, and of course, it also contained Luo Fan's strong will, and it was also a manifestation of the potential of the divine sense itself. In the face of such a chaotic impact, the platform began to shake constantly, and there were faint signs of instability. At this time, the boy's expression became extremely ugly. He did not stop moving and continued to mobilize the power he could mobilize in the entire third level of the Tao Master's path. Through various magical connections, the power was constantly injected into the platform, causing the platform to constantly transform. The platform was built here to condense the power of the entire third level of the Tao Master's path. However, he originally wanted to use this power to help his cultivation. But now, in the face of Luo Fan, he had to use these means to support his cultivation to fight against the enemy. Fortunately, the power of the third level of the Tao Master's path that he could mobilize was only a small part of the entire third level. But it was also the power of the entire third level of the Tao Master's path. The terrifying effect of this power had reached an unimaginable level. At this time, in the face of Luo Fan's attack, the platform was a little unstable at the beginning, but as time passed, even if the chaotic attacks became stronger, the platform became more and more stable. Vaguely, there seemed to be some kind of earth-shattering existence brewing in the depths of the platform. Seeing the situation develop to this point, the boy's expression did not change much. On the contrary, it became even more unsightly. Just looking at his face, it was easy to suspect that it was not Luo Fan who was at a disadvantage, but him. At this time, the conspirator stood at the side, a trace of curiosity in his expression. He seemed to be curious if the boy's means could deal with Luo Fan. Open. Suddenly, at a certain moment, the boy roared. With this roar, the platform suddenly exploded, and endless brilliance instantly shot out from the exploded fragments. In an instant, like a physical object, it brazenly poured into the surrounding gray chaos created by the divine ability of Luo Fan. In an instant, the chaos was torn apart, and a world was formed within it. The scenery of these worlds was extremely strange. Although each world was quite complete and quite fragile, one could vaguely find similarities in the third level of the Tao Master's path. It felt as if the light had directly transferred the information of the third level of the Tao Master's path to these divine abilities and directly reconstructed the divine abilities according to the corresponding information. At this moment, Luo Fan received countless feedback. Mysterious and complicated information constantly poured into his heart through the divine ability and constantly integrated into it. It made him feel that his understanding of the third level of the Tao Master's path was growing every moment. In a trance, he almost fell into a state of enlightenment where there was no one and no me. Is this an attack on me? At this time, such a thought could not help but appear in Luo Fan's mind. Looking at the boy's means, it was clearly an attack on him. However, the result of this attack, on the contrary, made him feel that he was constantly gaining benefits. This situation, no matter how one looked at it, was difficult to understand. However, he only hesitated for a short while and directly immersed his mind into the countless information. No matter what the other party was thinking at this time, the other party's actions could bring him benefits, so there was no way he would give up. In fact, although this time the battle with the boy had happened somewhat inexplicably, as if it was completely due to the boy's willfulness, the final result made him feel extremely satisfied. Not only did he understand the development direction and sublimation direction of the divine ability in the previous battle, but at this time, with the help of the boy's means, he could carry out a comprehensive and in-depth understanding of the entire third level of the Tao Master's path. For him, this was like a pie falling from the sky, and it was enough to make him very satisfied. Luo Fan stood there quietly, with an inexplicable expression on his face, which contained a kind of indescribable joy. His eyes became even more dazed and blank. However, although his mind was immersed in the understanding, the chaos caused by the superposition of his divine ability became more and more chaotic. Moreover, because of the inclination of his heart, this chaos constantly evolved in the direction of increasing the power. Wave after wave of attacks, one after another, shocking changes after another, constantly poured towards the platform. During this process, it constantly interweaved and collided with the numerous rays of light that were being released from the platform, and then it evolved into countless mysterious and wondrous worlds. At this time, the expression on the boy's face became quite strange. Looking at his face, there was a hint of admiration, some disbelief, and some even gnashing his teeth. He really threw himself into it without any hesitation at all. In this world, there is actually such a practitioner. The original goal of this platform was to condense the power of the entire third level of the Tao Master's path to help his own cultivation. Therefore, when the power of this platform was truly stimulated, although it might contain infinite lethality, no matter how he weakened or changed it, there was absolutely no lack of features that could help his cultivation. That was to say, at this time, even if he wanted to stimulate the power of this platform to become a means of absolute lethality to Luo Fan, it was impossible for him to do so. At the very most, he could add a kind of destructive power to that kind of power. Forget it. Why should I be angry with such a person? A sense of helplessness emerged in the boy's heart. According to the boy's original thought, even if this power might bring some benefits, his opponent would inevitably suspect whether there was any conspiracy or some kind of calculation in it, because it was released by his opponent. Therefore, it was impossible for him to be completely immersed in the benefits brought by it. Once he did not dare to be immersed in it, the benefits would naturally become a huge burden, causing him to have to divide a large part of his mental strength to resist. Combined with the destructive power that he added to the power, the strength of the damage could reach an unimaginable level. Maybe it could directly turn the tables and turn defeat into victory. However, he did not expect that Luo Fan in front of him would have such a firm heart for cultivation. Even if it was an attack from his opponent, as long as it contained something beneficial to him, he would not hesitate to accept it. He did not worry at all that the benefits might contain a trap, nor did he worry about whether his opponent was scheming against him. This approach completely destroyed his calculations, causing him to go for wool and come home shorn. Not only could he not attack Luo Fan, but he could also even bring him endless benefits. Under the secret, complex emotions, the boy's reason, which was originally covered by his obsession, began to emerge again. At this time, he just realized that there was no irreconcilable relationship between him and Luo Fan. In fact, it was only because he was curious about where Luo Fan was hiding. It was precisely because he was curious about where Luo Fan was hiding that he could not find Luo Fan no matter how hard he tried, which finally led to the current situation. It could be said that there was no real enmity between them, nor was there any conflict of interest. After thinking about this, he could not help but smile bitterly. This battle happened for no reason at all. At this moment, when he looked at Luo Fan again, the look in his eyes had changed. A kind of admiration finally took the upper hand, suppressing all other emotions. He was also a wandering cultivator, so he naturally knew how difficult it was for a wandering cultivator to cultivate. After all, he had millions of fortuitous encounters and put in a lot of effort to cultivate to this level. As for Luo Fan, he relied on a wandering cultivator to cultivate to this level. His talent was so high that it was beyond the limits of his imagination. He did not have the slightest confidence that he could surpass Luo Fan. Now that he had regained his rationality, how could he not feel admiration? At this moment, he sighed and said to the conspirator, "You can go. You don't need to worry about things here." With that, regardless of what the conspirator did, he swept the conspirator away and threw him to a random spot on the third floor of the path of Tao Master. This development of the situation was completely beyond the conspirator's expectation, leaving him at a loss at this time. What's going on? Wasn't the battle in full swing just now? Why was I suddenly thrown out? What does this mean? Do they not want to fight anymore? Or do they have some tricks to hide from me? He murmured, his heart full of doubts. The boy could guess the conspirator's doubts, but he did not pay attention to it. At this time, he just sat cross-legged and began to immerse his mind into the exploded platform below, blending into the light that constantly penetrated it, and began to carefully comprehend the information contained in the third level of the road to Tao Master. This platform itself was condensed by the power of the third level of the Tao Master's path. Such a platform in itself was actually something that exceeded the limits of his control. If it had not been detonated, he would naturally have been able to decide when the platform would be activated and when it would release the power contained in it. But now, After the entire platform had been detonated, there was no way for him to stop the platform from continuing to explode. In other words, for the current him, he could either directly give up the opportunities contained in this platform and the cultivation principles contained in it, or he could only immerse himself in the light and use the light to absorb the infinite principles condensed from the third level of the Tao Master's path. If this was before, when his reason was obscured by his obsession, there is no need to say that his choice would naturally be to give up the principles and activate the power to make things difficult for Luo Fan. But now that he had regained his reason, he naturally knew what was more precious. He understood which was more important, a moment of anger or one's own cultivation foundation. As he immersed himself in the light, the destructive power contained in the light began to gradually weaken, and the terrifying power triggered by the many divine abilities released by Luo Fan began to become more and more gentle. Finally, at a certain moment, a balance was formed with the light, causing the principles and information contained in the light to be released more smoothly and faster. This change was of great benefit to both Luo Fan and the boy, causing both of them to involuntarily reveal an inexplicable smile on their faces. With this change, this area fell into a strange balance, as if it had turned into a sky curtain, directly occupying a corner of the third level of the Tao Master's path, becoming a holy land for the cultivators in the third level of the Tao Master's path. Chapter 21-22. In the blink of an eye, 100,000 years had passed. During these 100,000 years, countless cultivators nearby had sensed the special changes in the place where Luo Fan and the boy were and had rushed over from all directions to look at the phenomenon that had just appeared on the third level of the Tao Sovereign's path. The moment they saw the phenomenon, they were instantly immersed in the endless mysteries that belonged to the third level of the Tao Sovereign's path. In the eyes of weak cultivators, the casual methods of powerful cultivators were peerless opportunities that contained endless mysteries. Just like the Tao Sovereign's path, wasn't it the methods of many true saints? It went without saying what kind of opportunity it was for cultivators below the Tao Sovereign realm. Similarly, the strength of Luo Fan and the boy had clearly far surpassed the limits of the third level of the Tao Sovereign's path. The methods they were using now were obviously extremely profound methods for the cultivators on the third level of the Tao Sovereign's path, and they were where endless opportunities lay. Over the years, countless cultivators had used the mysteries of the third level of the Tao Sovereign's path to break through their shackles and obtain the extraordinary power of the third level of the Tao Sovereign's path. There were even some cultivators who had obtained extraordinary power that broke through their final limits and obtained the qualifications to ascend. This kind of benefit was simply the most direct temptation for many cultivators. Under this kind of temptation, more and more cultivators threw themselves into this phenomenon. They continuously tried to comprehend the profoundness within and observe the various profound words that belong to the third level. Even the order that the boy had established in the third level of the Tao Sovereign's path could not stop this trend of change. In the end, after 100,000 years, the area around this area had formed a circle of settlements, and hundreds of bustling cities had been built. Moreover, the price of land in the city was completely determined by the angle of view of this phenomenon. On this day, at the highest point of the city, the conspirator looked at the phenomenon in front of him and thought, "I didn't expect it to develop to this point." His insight was naturally not something other cultivators could compare to. The other cultivators could only see the endless mysteries of the third level that were revealed in the phenomenon. However, he was different. In his eyes, he could see that during these 100,000 years, Luo Fan and the boy had rejected and resisted each other at the very beginning. Then, they gradually became in sync, and recently, they even complemented each other. Their communication had even reached a level where their hearts were connected to each other. It could be said that they had gone from being like enemies and friends to being close friends. This kind of change was unimaginable to the conspirator, who had been watching how the two of them fought and fought from the beginning. For a moment, he was at a loss for what to do. Perhaps it's because of this mentality that they've reached this stage as independent cultivators. This thought quickly appeared in his mind, and he couldn't help but sigh. The boy and Luo Fan had one thing in common. They were both rogue cultivators. As independent cultivators, they should have stood under all the sects of Tao Masters, and it was impossible for them to stand out. However, both of them stood out among the obstacles of many sects of Tao Masters, and even made him, a Tao Master who had come down from the 4th level of the Tao Master's path, feel a sense of despair. The achievements of such an existence were obviously beyond the imagination of all living beings. All along, the conspirator had been attached to the boy and helped the boy to plan all kinds of things. But in fact, in his heart, he also wanted to find out why the boy could be so powerful. However, from the beginning to the present, he had gained very little, and he had no idea why the boy could reach this stage. In his investigation, it seemed that the boy could reach this stage because of one fortuitous encounter after another, one opportunity after another, and one burst of luck after another. Only now, when he saw Luo Fan's similar achievements, did he vaguely understand that perhaps the two of them treated cultivation as their everything. They treated everything that was beneficial to their cultivation as their target, and they treated everything that was detrimental to their cultivation as something they abhorred. That was the only reason why they were able to reach such a stage. Perhaps it seems to be good to continue to follow him. Suddenly, this idea came to his mind again. When he saw that the boy was not as good as Luo Fan, the conspirator actually had the intention to leave. He felt that the boy was no longer a wise master, and was no longer an existence that could become a Tao Master as he had thought. But now, after 100,000 years of observation and sensing the boy's unimaginable Taoist heart, the conspirator had unknowingly dispelled his intention to leave. Forget it. Anyway, there is no better person to rely on now, so I'll follow him. After a long time, he sighed, and his eyes became firm again. Different cultivators had different ways of cultivation, and it was the same even for the disciples of Tao Masters. Moreover, compared to independent cultivators, the disciples of Tao Masters had a much richer way of cultivation because they had the guidance of Tao Masters. Obviously, the conspirator's way of cultivation seemed to involve relying on others at this moment. After he made up his mind, the power in his body became more and more active, and his aura suddenly shook and became more and more powerful. The extraordinary power in his body became more and more refined during this process, and the power that could be triggered from the 3rd level of the Tao Master's path became more and more powerful. There is such an unexpected gain, he murmured, and his expression finally became completely calm. Then he waved his hand, and his body shook. He had already soared into the sky and turned into a huge figure. He arrived in midair and said, "This place is about to disappear. Fellow Taoists, please leave within 3 days. If you don't leave within 3 days, you will bear the consequences." His voice spread through the area around the phenomenon and entered the ears of all the cultivators, no matter how well hidden they were. All the cultivators in the area who were affected by the phenomenon could hear his voice in an instant. For cultivators, there were naturally people who wanted to get lucky, but most of them could still recognize the situation. For a terrifying expert like the conspirator, any words he said would carry a lot of weight to any cultivator. Even if he was just talking nonsense, they would rather believe him than not believe him. Furthermore, they had already faintly sensed many of the things that the conspirator had mentioned. Therefore, at this moment, a large number of cultivators left their places of cultivation and went directly to the void. They bowed to the conspirator and thanked him for his reminder. Then, they turned around and used their own methods to fly into the distance, trying to get as far away from the phenomenon as possible. However, it was clear that, as mentioned before, there were still cultivators who wanted to try their luck. At the same time, there were many cultivators who remained unmoved and treated the words of the schemer as wind passing by their ears as they focused on comprehending the profundities within the phenomenon. The conspirator, naturally, could not be bothered with these cultivators who wanted to get lucky. In any case, his warning had already been delivered. It was entirely up to the others to decide whether they would listen to him or not, and whether they would leave or not. Just as he said before, they had to bear the consequences. Seeing that the cultivators did not leave, his heart stirred. He took a step forward, and his figure gradually disappeared. In the blink of an eye, it was as if he had never appeared. Oof. Do you think I won't know that you want to monopolize this cultivation holy land just because you're hiding? A cultivator snorted in disdain and immersed himself in the boundless comprehension. The mysteries of the phenomenon were extremely profound. For the cultivators cultivating on the third floor, the benefits were simply earth-shattering. With such benefits, almost all the cultivators who saw it could benefit and improve. As for those who were lucky and had wonderful opportunities, the benefits they obtained were even more astonishing. Some of them even continuously broke through one realm after another. The cultivators who remained in the cities around the phenomenon were clearly the cultivators who would come later. Only with sufficient benefits would they dare to take such a risk and dare to have such a fluke that would affect their own lives. 3 days passed in the blink of an eye. When the 3 days were up, the cultivators began to sneer and laugh. This was because they discovered that the phenomenon did not change at all during these 3 days. Forget about collapsing. There wasn't even the slightest sign of it collapsing or the slightest trace of destruction. This situation made them even more certain of their original thoughts. That cultivator was just trying to scare them. They were absolutely right not to leave. Just as their laughter had yet to dissipate, space shook, and an indescribable fluctuation instantly swept through the surrounding space. As the ripples spread out, the cities that had been strengthened by countless cultivators and set up countless formations gradually collapsed as they rumbled and trembled. The entire process was so simple that it was as if they were not defenses at all, but just models made of sand. At this moment, the cultivators turned pale with fright. The shock and regret in their hearts drowned them. However, it was clear that it was already too late. The ripple that easily destroyed the cities also swept through their bodies. In an instant, it broke through their extraordinary power defenses and entered their bodies. It began to disintegrate their bodies, their power, their life source, and even their deeper concept of existence. In an instant, the cultivators collapsed and died, disappearing without a trace in the blink of an eye. In just a single strange ripple, everything that the cultivators had created over the past 100,000 years had completely disappeared. The surroundings had completely returned to the emptiness from 100,000 years ago, as if 100,000 years had never happened. Immediately afterward, the phenomenon trembled, and an earth-shattering explosion occurred in an instant. Terrifying shock waves swept out in all directions, and the area within the radius of an unknown number of light years was instantly crushed, directly turning into a chaotic state similar to that of primal chaos. However, the chaos quickly began to condense under the power of the third layer of the Tao Master's path. In the blink of an eye, it had returned to its normal state of clarity. However, all the living beings that lived in this place had completely disappeared. Whether it was the cultivators, the natives of the third layer, or the mindless wild beasts, divine beasts, or immortal beasts, they had all disappeared. There was only an indescribable silence that appeared in the area within an unknown number of light years. After the phenomenon dissipated, there were 2 figures floating in the void at the center of the phenomenon. These 2 figures were none other than Luo Fan and the boy. However, at this time, the 2 of them were no longer in a state where they were at loggerheads. Instead, they were like old friends, and there was an inexplicable harmony between their auras. I didn't expect Fellow's cultivation path to be so mysterious. It's a pity that I can't leave. At this moment, the boy sighed and said to Luo Fan. After all these years of comprehending together, his aura had fused with Luo Fan's, and their thoughts had been exchanged. He had a rather deep understanding of Luo Fan's path of cultivation. Although it was impossible for him to completely understand the true essence of Luo Fan's path of cultivation, he had a rough understanding of Luo Fan's goal of cultivation. He understood the advantages and difficulties of cultivation. Of course, he believed that Luo Fan must have a similar or even deeper understanding of him. For ordinary living beings, and even ordinary cultivators, this was equivalent to completely exposing one's secrets. It was an absolutely intolerable situation. However, for the two of them, this was nothing. Whether it was Luo Fan or the boy, they would not take this to heart. That was because at their level, they had already recognized the true essence of cultivation. They had understood that their cultivation path was only suitable for themselves. Apart from themselves, no matter how powerful other existences were, even if they cultivated their own cultivation path, their final achievements would not be able to compare to their own. Under such circumstances, they naturally didn't need to worry about the consequences of exposing their cultivation path. Fellow's cultivation path is also very mysterious, so why are you envious of mine? Luo Fan only smiled faintly. The two of them looked at each other and smiled. Then, the boy asked, I have a question that has been bothering me for a long time. I hope Fellow can teach me. Fellow Taoist, could it be that you want to know where I was hiding all those years? Why couldn't you find it? Luo Fan smiled. Back then, Luo Fan might not have known why the boy was so hostile to him. But after comprehending together over the years and absorbing the nutrients of the third level of the Tao Master's path together, he already knew what the boy's mentality was. He also understood what was bothering him. Yes, I hope Fellow can enlighten me, the boy said with a solemn expression. Luo Fan smiled slightly and said, Fellow should be able to sense where I was hiding now. Why don't you try? Hearing this, the boy was slightly stunned, and then two bright lights flashed in his eyes. Countless lights and shadows began to flicker wildly between his eyes. Space-time and layers of nomological laws were constantly being dissected in his eyes. Not long after, a strange place appeared in his eyes. It turns out that Fellow is hiding in the origin of the nomological laws. No wonder I couldn't find you back then, the boy said with a bitter smile. He looked a little helpless and didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The problem that had been bothering him for hundreds of thousands of years was solved so easily. The area that Luo Fan was hiding in was a place that didn't exist in his thoughts. It was the origin of the nomological laws. Because he didn't think that the origin of the nomological laws existed, he naturally couldn't find the origin of the nomological laws, no matter how hard he tried. Naturally, he couldn't find where Luo Fan was hiding. At this time, after communicating with Luo Fan for 100,000 years, he already knew Luo Fan's thoughts and the existence of the nomological laws in Luo Fan's mind. Therefore, he could naturally find the origin of the nomological laws. It could be said that what really shackled the boy was actually just a change of thinking. As long as he changed his thinking, then naturally, nothing could stop him. Unfortunately, even if I know, I still won't be able to find you if you hide again. After feeling helpless, the boy smiled bitterly again. Although he had already discovered the existence of the nomological laws, he would still be able to find Luo Fan the next time he hid there. However, that was only the origin of the nomological laws. Who knew if Luo Fan knew about other existences that he didn't know about? If he hid in an existence that he didn't realize existed the next time, how would he be able to find him? Isn't this very normal? Fellow Taoist can't find me, so naturally, I can't find you either. Luo Fan just smiled. When the boy heard this, a smile appeared on his face. Indeed, he was an itinerant cultivator. He had relied on himself to cultivate to this point. In his countless years of cultivation, how many strange concepts had he established? How many things that he knew that others couldn't? This was something that he still couldn't be sure of. However, he knew that there must be things that existed in his knowledge that definitely didn't exist in the knowledge of other cultivators. Obviously, if he wanted to hide, as long as he hid in it, no other cultivator would be able to detect his existence. Chapter 21-23. Although there wasn't much communication between them, the previous 100,000 years of heart-to-heart understanding had allowed Luo Fan and the boy to understand each other to a certain extent. With such a deep understanding, they already knew each other's thoughts without needing to speak much. At this moment, they didn't waste any time talking. In the time it took to say a few words, they had already separated. The 100,000 years of continuous absorption of nutrients from the third level of the Tao Master's path was a huge harvest beyond imagination for both of them. Now, what they needed to do the most was obviously to digest the previous harvest, if not for anything else. After leaving the boy, Luo Fan's figure flickered and directly arrived outside the origin of the laws on the third level of the Tao Master's path. The third level of the Tao Master's path existed in the form of heaven and earth, so it naturally had almost all the characteristics of heaven and earth. The laws of laws, time, space, matter, energy, and so on naturally existed. Similarly, the existence of many factors meant that the origin of the laws of laws in the depths of the laws of laws naturally existed. However, the heaven and earth reflected in the third level of the Tao Master's path was too grand, too deep, and too mysterious. Even the great heaven and earth seemed to be insignificant compared to the third level. Under such circumstances, the laws of the third level were naturally beyond imagination for Luo Fan. The origin of the laws of the third level was even more complicated and indescribable for him. Even though Luo Fan had come here, he couldn't comprehend the origin of the laws at will. He could only use his own worldview to interfere with the origin of the laws and barely open a gap in the origin of the laws to enter it. Of course, it would be more accurate to say that he had used his worldview of laws to interact with the origin of the natural order and gradually opened up a space-time corresponding to the worldview of laws on the origin of the natural order to accommodate himself. It could be said that the relationship between such a space-time and the origin of the laws was only a relationship that was connected to the origin of the laws. Apart from that, he couldn't obtain the slightest power from the origin of the laws, let alone use the origin of the laws of the entire third level of the Tao Master's path. In fact, it was precisely because of this that the boy was unable to discover his existence back then. After all, that boy was the ruler of the third level of the path to becoming a Tao sovereign. If Luo Fan had really changed the laws, then there would definitely be traces left behind, and it would definitely be discovered by the Overlord who was thoroughly investigating the third layer of the Tao Sovereign's path. With a slight thought, Luo Fan had already sensed the location of the space-time that he had opened up. With a single step, he had already stepped into the space-time, disappearing from the senses of any cultivators who didn't know about the origin of the law. Of course, the boy was no longer among them. At this moment, the boy occasionally scanned the area with his senses and discovered that Luo Fan had disappeared into the origin of the natural order. An inexplicable emotion appeared on his face. However, he quickly threw all of this to the back of his mind. He still needed to spend a lot of time to digest the harvest he had gained in the past 100,000 years. So how could he have a time to care about where Luo Fan was hiding? As for the situation in the third level of the Tao Master's path, it was not a problem even if it was missing him for 100,000 years. It would not be a problem even if it was missing another 100,000 years or even millions of years, so he didn't need to care about it. His heart skipped a beat, and he slowly closed his eyes. His body began to gradually dissipate, and in the end, he completely disappeared. He entered a place that only he knew existed, and no other living being knew existed. Even Luo Fan only knew about this place when he had a heart-to-heart communication with the boy in the past 100,000 years apart from him. Even the conspirator did not think that the place where he was hiding was real at this time. In other words, even the conspirator would not be able to discover the boy's existence at this time. At the moment when he disappeared, the conspirator's figure emerged out of thin air and stood on the void where the platform used to be. There was an inexplicable helplessness on his face. "You're the master of the third level, not me." Compared to the boy's intense reaction to Luo Fan hiding in an area that he could not find, the conspirator's reaction to the boy hiding in an area that he could not find was extremely calm. After all, although he was a Tao Master's disciple, he was just a subordinate of the boy in the third level. Even if he had some authority here, it was still a far cry from the boy's. With such a gap in strength, it was normal for the boy to think of a way to avoid his detection. It was not surprising at all. On the other hand, if the hiding place of the boy was something that he could detect, he would suspect that the boy was suspicious of him and deliberately appeared there to test his loyalty. At that moment, he sighed. He could only continue to raise the pillar of order in the third level and continue to control the various operations of the third level like he had done for the past 100,000 years. At this moment, his heart skipped a beat. He found that a creature that he had previously detected had appeared in his senses. Oh, it has reappeared? This thought came to his mind at this moment. Then, with a thought, he used the power of the third level of the Tao Master's Road to directly cross an unknown distance in time and space. He directly appeared in a place that was about dozens of large worlds away from where he was originally. That place was a mountain peak. It was a mountain with an extremely wonderful cultivation environment. Every material contained an almost perfect world, and its mysteries were extraordinarily obvious. Moreover, it was a mountain that had not been discovered by any other cultivators and had not been occupied by other cultivators as a cave residence. At this moment, there was an old man looking around blankly. The moment the conspirator appeared here, the old man's eyes narrowed and revealed an inexplicable solemnity. Don't worry, the current situation is completely different from before. Seeing the old man's expression, the conspirator smiled and said so. Hearing this, the old man slightly relaxed and said, "It seems that he really didn't lie to me. I didn't expect that the exchange that happened billions of years ago would create this opportunity for me. I wonder where you have been hiding all these years. I have investigated for a long time, but I can't find anything at all." The conspirator said to the old man with a smile. The old man was obviously the one that Luo Fan sent into the origin of the natural order, the one that had karma with him. At this moment, hearing the conspirator's question, a trace of confusion appeared in the old man's eyes, and he said, "Actually, I don't know either. Over the past 100,000 years, I seem to have entered a bizarre space. In that place, all laws were clear, and there were endless laws being poured into my heart at every moment. However, those truths were all profound and unfathomable, and with my realm, I couldn't understand them at all. It wasn't until just now that he sent me out." "Oh, it's actually so mysterious?" The conspirator sighed in surprise. "Perhaps it's because my realm is not high enough." The old man sighed with an indescribable helplessness on his face. However, it was only helplessness. As for the negative emotions, such as discouragement and despair, they did not appear in his eyes. After all, he was a powerful existence that had cultivated for billions of years. If he did not have this kind of mentality, he would have been unable to withstand the passage of time and collapse countless billions of years ago. "I am now temporarily managing the entire third floor on behalf of the ruler of the third floor. I wonder if you're interested in taking up a position?" The conspirator smiled and said to the old man. Hearing this, the old man smiled bitterly and shook his head. "Forget it. For me, cultivation is more important now. Taking up a position might be beneficial to my cultivation, but it will only hold up part of my energy. The gains do not make up for the losses." The conspirator was not too surprised by the old man's decision, so he did not continue to pester him. He only spoke with the old man for a while longer and dispelled the misgivings in his heart. Then, he disappeared without a trace. After the conspirator disappeared, the old man raised his head to look at the sky of the third floor. He looked at the endless time and space that appeared in the sky. He looked at the endless truths that appeared in the endless time and space, and the endless truths he had absorbed before faintly appeared in his heart bit by bit. After a long while, he smiled in relief. With a wave of his hand, a wave of power directly enveloped the mountain. As it trembled slightly, he began to use an extremely subtle method to modify the mountain. As he modified it, a cave abode appeared on the mountain. It was tightly integrated with the mountain, causing the mountain to faintly become one. Endless truths and mysteries began to pour into the cave abode. The old man didn't hesitate when he saw this. He lifted his foot and lightly strode into the cave. He seemed to have entered into hibernation as he started to immerse himself in the numerous principles and profundities that were being condensed ceaselessly from all directions. As he entered this state, the cave abode and the mountain began to gradually disappear. In the end, it was as if a large space had suddenly been emptied. Although he did not know the essence of the origin of the law due to his lack of knowledge, he had stayed in it for 100,000 years. Even if he did not understand it, his body and will had unknowingly absorbed a lot of the characteristics of the origin of the law. At this moment, he fused these characteristics into the cave abode and the mountain, allowing the cave abode and the mountain to naturally obtain a trace of the characteristics of the origin of the law. In other words, those who did not know the origin of the law would find it difficult to discover the existence of the cave abode and the mountain. Of course, after all, it was only a trace of the characteristics. Although these characteristics existed, they could not be very powerful. Therefore, although in theory, cultivators who did not know the origin of the law would not be able to discover the existence of the cave abode and the mountain, as long as they were strong enough and had keen senses, they would eventually be able to discover the mountain and the cave abode. However, it was obvious that this was the limit of what the old man could do. It was more than enough to be used in this secluded place. Just as the old man was modifying the cave abode and the mountain, the conspirator had already arrived at another place. This was the place where many Tao masters cultivated. Don't forget, in addition to the conspirator, there were many other Tao masters who had helped the boy. The mentality of these Tao masters was actually similar to the conspirator. Although their cultivation path was not like the conspirators, they did not rely on some experts. Now that the boy had one, they could naturally enjoy the fruits of victory. At this moment, the area where they were located was actually the best cultivation place on the third level of the Tao Master's path. This was a strange space-time in which the void was distorted by some strange law, reflecting almost all the scenes in the third level of the Tao Master's path. Moreover, because of that distortion, the mysteries of the many nearly perfect worlds in the scene were thousands of times more obvious than before. The endless mysteries and principles intertwined, turning this space-time into a sea of principles. The many Tao masters were like fish swimming in the sea of principles. They were extremely comfortable and happy, immersed in it, enjoying the wonderful feeling of the mysteries being injected into their bodies every moment. For these Tao masters, they were originally from the fourth level of the Tao master's path. The driving force that drove them to go against the Tao master's path to the third level was that their foundation in the third level was not solid enough. Under such circumstances, what they were doing at this time was actually to reconsolidate their foundation. Moreover, it was thousands of times more solid than before. The endless information, the endless principles, and the endless mysteries were constantly being poured into their bodies, and their essence was changing bit by bit. Although the aura of their bodies was not growing all the time, it was being stabilized all the time. The original traces of loopholes were constantly being filled and eliminated in the process. When the conspirator arrived, the many Tao masters ignored him and were wholeheartedly immersed in that kind of comfort. Seeing this, the conspirator smiled bitterly and said, "It seems that you are not even interested in knowing what is happening outside." His words did not receive any reply. For the many Tao masters, the answer to this question was simply obvious, and there was no need to answer it at all. The conspirator also knew what the many Tao masters were thinking, so he immediately said, "Fellow Taoists, it is better for you to listen. This time, there is a great opportunity waiting for you to seize." Hearing this, most of the Tao masters ignored him and were wholeheartedly immersed in the sea of information, mysteries, and principles. But there were also a small number of Tao masters who opened their eyes and turned to look at the conspirator curiously. However, this was only an extremely small portion of them, and the total number was less than 20. However, for the conspirator, this was clearly enough. Obviously, he did not intend to let all the Tao masters join him. As long as a few Tao masters were willing to join, it was enough to be successful. Immediately, he said to the dozens of Tao masters, "This time there are some changes in the entire third level, and a large part of the authority will not be controlled. This is an opportunity for you. If you can get that authority, you'll be able to control a large part of the third level. At that time, your cultivation will be more convenient, and you'll even be able to get a lot of merit." Hearing this, half of the dozens of Tao masters directly closed their eyes and continued to be immersed in their original cultivation, as if they had heard nothing. Only the remaining 8 Tao masters were still interested. One of the Tao masters asked, "Getting that authority will take up our energy." The price we pay is obviously not proportional to the benefits we get. I don't think this is an opportunity." The conspirator just smiled and said, "That's why you don't know how much the situation in the third level has changed. The third level today is different from before. Now the benefits of obtaining authority are countless times greater than before. If you don't believe me, you can follow me to have a look." Hearing this, the hearts of the 8 Tao masters were moved. The fact that they were able to listen until now meant that they were rather interested in this matter. Now that they were encouraged by the conspirator, they were finally tempted. Anyway, even if it was different from what he said, in the end, it was just a waste of time. Compared to the benefits that could be obtained, it was obviously worth wasting a little time. Immediately, the 8 Tao masters all stood up, lifted a step, and lightly stepped to the side of the conspirator, saying, "Then let's have a look." Hearing this, the conspirator was overjoyed and said with a smile, "You will never regret it." With that, he opened the passage to the outside world and took the 8 of them out of this space-time. Put the cart before the horse. At this moment, a Tao master's disciple among the many Tao masters spat out these words. Obviously, he did not agree with the actions of the 8 Tao masters. Chapter 21-24. For these disciples of Tao masters, they still had the arrogance of being disciples of Tao masters. Even if they were actually helping the rogue cultivator and betraying the Taoist master's sect, they still couldn't change their arrogance that came from within. With such arrogance, it was clear that they didn't think much of the boy in the depths of their hearts. With such a mentality, they were quite disdainful of honestly helping that boy, working for that boy, and taking on that boy's authority in exchange for some benefits that the boy left behind. To them, they had helped the boy in exchange for such an excellent cultivation environment. This was the end of their entanglement with the boy. What they needed to do next was to put all of this behind them and work hard to cultivate and strengthen their foundations. Finally, they could ascend to the Tao of immortality in a more perfect state, or even further, to the Tao of 5th level or even 6th level, which they had never dared to look forward to before. Under such circumstances, seeing that the other disciples of the Tao masters were attracted by the boy's authority and eventually wasted their own cultivation time to help the boy manage the entire 3rd level of the Tao master path, how could these disciples not think that they were putting the cart before the horse? How could they not think that the other disciples of the Tao masters had lost the correct will to cultivate? After the disdainful sneer, those disciples of the Tao masters once again immersed themselves in the state of cultivation. At this time, the void fell back into its original state of silence, as if nothing had happened before. Although the conspirator did not see the views of the many boys with his own eyes, he could guess it. However, he did not care about this at all. When he had dared to abandon his own camp to help the boy, he had already made up his mind to put all the outsiders' opinions behind him. For him, he did not care even if all the Tao masters and all the cultivators of the Tao masters despised him, let alone a few disciples of the Tao masters. Not to mention that the opinions of those disciples of the Tao masters were extremely pedantic and could even be called stupid. Under such circumstances, he naturally did not care about what those disciples of the Tao masters thought. At this time, he led the 8 Tao masters and used the authority granted to him by the boy to flash around the 3rd level of the Tao master's path. In the blink of an eye, he left the 8 Tao masters in a certain area and gave them some kind of authority, allowing them to control a certain kind of authority in a large area and sharing the pressure of managing the 3rd level of the Tao master's path. After a few times, he distributed the 8 types of authority that brought him the greatest burden. In the end, he felt his body lighten, as if a boundless burden had been lifted. As expected, authority can bring great benefits. A certain Tao master's disciple, who had been placed by the conspirator to assume some kind of authority on the 3rd level of the Tao master's path, muttered with inexplicable joy in his eyes. At this time, his body seemed to be connected with the entire 3rd level of the Tao master's path. The nomological law of the 3rd level was operating and seemed to have regarded his body as a node. Endless information and truths were constantly flowing through his body and mind, although there was not much left and was absorbed by him. However, Just the scouring traces of the information flow had already brought him great benefits, making him feel that his cultivation realm was growing at every moment. Moreover, the speed of his growth was many times faster than when he was cultivating in the void, where the environment for cultivation was excellent. Obviously, he was not the only one who had this feeling. In fact, the 8 Tao Master's disciples who had been separated all had the same feeling. In fact, because they had all received the authority of the third floor, they could be considered colleagues to a certain extent. Although the 8 of them were scattered across the third floor and were far away from each other, they could communicate with each other through the connection of authority, understand each other's thoughts, and understand each other's situation. For a moment, they all understood each other's changes and could not help but feel inexplicable joy in their hearts. They were glad that they had made this choice under the contempt of the many Tao Masters. If they did not make this choice, they would still be frogs at the bottom of a well, only guarding their own small world, not knowing how wide the world was. As for whether or not the 8 Tao Masters were satisfied with the benefits brought about by the power, the conspirator did not have the slightest doubt. If such benefits were not enough to satisfy them, then he could not think of any benefits that could satisfy them. At this time, after distributing part of his authority, the conspirator came to a node of the third level and began to sit cross-legged. His figure gradually disappeared. As he disappeared, an indescribable wave began to spread in all directions from his original position, gradually sweeping over every inch of the third level of the Tao Master's path. In an extremely fierce and swift manner, it had already swept through the entire third level of the Tao Master's path in a very short period of time, including every inch of the third level of the space-time and every inch of the world into the wave. Wisp by wisp, information gathered towards the source of the fluctuation and was gradually absorbed into the source of the fluctuation. In other words, it was absorbed into the heart of the conspirator. With this change, the conspirator's understanding of the entire third level deepened at every moment. The mysteries of the third level were also revealed in front of him bit by bit. In this process, he felt that his cultivation level, which had not been seen for a long time, began to increase again. From this appearance, it was clear that the conspirator had also fallen into a state of cultivation. As the conspirator fell into a state of cultivation, the situation of the entire third level of the Tao Master's path became more and more stable. The adjustments that the conspirator might have made disappeared. The entire third level of the Tao Master's path seemed to have fallen into a stable and unchanging stage. During this process, time slowly passed. 1,000,000 years passed in the blink of an eye. On this day, the laws of the third level began to produce some kind of vibration that no cultivator in the third level of the Tao Master's path could understand. This vibration was so strong and so obvious that it even made people feel as if there was an invisible hand stirring the laws of the third level. Such a strange change immediately awakened many authority holders in the third level of the Tao Master's path. In other words, the boy, the conspirator, and the many cultivators who had been given authority by the conspirator, the disciples of the 8 Tao Masters with the highest authority, also woke up under the appearance of this strange fluctuation and left the state of cultivation. What's going on? The conspirator's eyes were a little dazed and vigilant. This change almost covered every inch of the third level of the Tao Master's path and affected every strand of power. It had completely destroyed the perfect cultivation environment that he had originally obtained with the help of his authority. It made it difficult for him to sink into the state of cultivation again. The feeling of having one's cultivation state broken was naturally depressing. Even a scheming schemer like this one could not help but feel depressed at this moment. At this moment, he sensed that an extremely powerful existence had appeared in his senses and began to suppress the changes on the third level of the Tao Master's path and quickly restore the cultivation environment that had been destroyed by the vibration. At this moment, he knew that the powerful existence was none other than the target he had attached himself to, the boy who was the ruler of the third level of the Tao Master's path. After learning that the boy had reappeared, he did not dare to be careless. With a single thought, his body flickered and he passed through the supreme power of the third level of the Tao Master's path. He traversed the endless space-time and arrived before the boy. At this moment, the boy seemed to become more and more unfathomable to him. In the past, he could barely detect the other party's limit and knew that the other party was tens of thousands of times stronger than him. But now, facing the boy, he had no idea how much stronger the other party was. The multiplier was 1 digit, 2 digits, 3 digits, 4 digits, 5 digits, 6 digits, or even more. He could not sense it at all. I wonder what kind of power this is. Will it cause damage to the third level? The conspirator asked after appearing in front of the boy. Hearing this, the boy's expression was a little inexplicable. He seemed to be in disbelief, a little enlightened, and an inexplicable sense of loss. I already know who did it, but you don't have to worry about the third level being damaged. When the conspirator heard this, he suddenly came to a realization. In the third level, perhaps only that powerhouse could make this boy reveal such complicated emotions. I see. He murmured with inexplicable shock in his eyes. It was precisely because he understood what kind of existence caused all of this that he was even more shocked and incredulous. After all, it seemed that it had only been 1,000,000 years since he last saw that existence. At that time, it would take a great deal of energy and effort for that existence to change the environment of a certain area, let alone affect the entire third level of the Tao Master's path. But now, in just a short period of 1,000,000 years, that existence could actually use a random method that he did not understand to cause the entire third level to shake and affect the entire third level. Even if he had already made up his mind, he couldn't help but be a little shaken at this time. The conspirator did not know the existence of the origin of the law, so even if he guessed that the one who caused the entire third level to shake was Luo Fan, he couldn't find the existence of Luo Fan no matter what. He couldn't even sense the source of the shaking. In contrast, the boy who knew about the existence of the origin of the law through his communication with Luo Fan was obviously different. He had already seen the figure that was walking out of the depths of the origin of the law step by step on the origin of the law, the figure that belonged to Luo Fan. He saw that the current Luo Fan was already a world of difference compared to the last time he met him. Back then, although Luo Fan was unparalleled, he could still barely sense the depth of Luo Fan's strength. He had the confidence that even if he couldn't defeat Luo Fan, he could definitely make Luo Fan suffer a big loss. But now, looking at Luo Fan, he found that he couldn't grasp the person in front of him at all. He couldn't even touch Luo Fan. It felt like no matter how much strength he used, how much effort he spent, and how much price he paid, he couldn't affect Yi Shiwen in the slightest. It was impossible to touch Yi Shiwen's bottom line. I didn't expect that the gap would increase to this extent in just 1,000,000 years. The boy's eyes revealed an indescribable complex emotion as he thought to himself. At this time, Luo Fan completely ignored the others. At this moment, he was walking out of the origin of the law on the third level of the Tao Master's road step by step into the normal space-time of the third level of the Tao Master's road. His figure gradually stepped out of the illusion and gradually emerged between heaven and earth. Every step he took was on the node of the origin of the law, and the node trembled slightly with his movements. Every tremble was constantly transmitted through the connection between the origin of the law and the infinite laws. It spread throughout the endless space-time of the third level of the Tao Master's road and all the almost perfect heaven and earth. At this time, there was only an inexplicable expression on Luo Fan's face. There seemed to be some joy in his expression, but also a little confusion. 3,000 years. He stood in the void and looked up at the sky. His eyes seemed to penetrate all obstacles and shone on a certain place in the state of chaos. Such a thought flashed in his mind. 3,000 years. This wasn't some random number. It was precisely the time he sensed that his fifth great tribulation was about to descend. That's right. After all these years of cultivation, his cultivation realm had made great progress. Now, he could accurately grasp the time when the major tribulation would arrive. At this time, his heart was filled with an indescribable sense of crisis and an indescribable sense of anticipation. The sense of crisis came from the terrifying danger of the fifth major tribulation, and the sense of anticipation came from the meaning of the arrival of the fifth major tribulation. He sensed the precise time when the fifth major tribulation would arrive, which meant that his cultivation realm had been raised to a high enough level to grasp the subtle changes of the major tribulation. This meant that he had taken another step forward from the true saint realm. At this moment, the third level of the Tao Master's Road no longer looked as unfathomable as before. In his eyes, this place had become a step, or rather, a threshold, a step to a higher level, a threshold to step into a whole new world. This invisible step and threshold appeared in the void. It seemed that he could cross it with just one step, but it also seemed that no matter how hard he tried, he could not touch it. At this time, he had an epiphany. This was the ascension rules of the third level. Now, as long as he was willing, he could trigger the ascension rules at any time, step on a step, leave the third level, and step into a higher level. So, this is what the ascension rules look like. This thought appeared in his mind at this moment. Given his strength, he had long possessed all his power on the third level of the Tao Master's Road. With all his strength, he could trigger the ascension rules at any time and ascend to the fourth level. However, it was only at this moment that he was able to clearly see what the ascension rules were like. In other words, it was only now that he had truly grasped the foundation of the third level of the Tao Master's Road and was truly qualified to touch the essence of the Tao Master's Road. With a slight thought, he raised his hand and stretched towards the void. In his own eyes, his hand was very ordinary as it stretched towards the step and threshold that represented the ascension rules and slowly touched the step. However, in the eyes of the outside world, his hand was unimaginably mysterious. The hand seemed to gradually turn into nothingness. When it finally straightened, the hand seemed to have completely disappeared, as if it had reached into the depths of the void to touch an unimaginably supreme existence. All the cultivators who saw this suddenly felt that the hand seemed to have grasped their life and death, grasped their everything. It seemed that as long as the hand was willing, they would not be able to resist at all and would be thrown to any place the hand wanted. Whether it was the schemer or the boy, both of them had the same feeling at this moment. What's going on? I've clearly become the master of the third level. Who else in the third level can make me feel this way? This thought flashed through the boy's mind at this moment, and the light in his eyes began to flicker continuously. Only now did he realize that although he seemed to have completely mastered the third level of the Tao Master's Road, in fact, he had only touched the surface. There were even more, deeper, and even more inconceivable mysteries waiting for him to explore, to understand, and to control. How'd he do it? With this thought, a doubt flashed through the boy's mind. Chapter 21-25. Obviously, Luo Fan did not care about the doubts in the hearts of the other living beings. At this moment, his heart stirred slightly. He carefully sensed the unique, subtle pulse of the ascension rules of the Tao Master's path in his hand, and felt the infinite and vast aura contained within it. At this moment, he vaguely saw that there were more steps below this step. As long as he was willing, he could step onto the next step, or even several steps, at any time. In an instant, he understood in his heart. These were the second and first levels of the Tao Master's path. As long as he stepped onto the steps below, he would naturally be able to step directly into the second or even the first level. Moreover, he was absolutely sure that even if he stepped onto the second or first level, he would not encounter the Tao Master's prison that other cultivators would inevitably encounter when returning from the third level to the first two levels, because this was allowed by the Tao Master's path. After all, if he stepped onto the first two levels now, he would not be taking advantage of some loophole in the Tao Master's path or some imperfection of the Tao Master's path to return. Instead, he would be relying on himself to understand the essence of the Tao Master's path and relying on himself to dig out the deeper mysteries of the Tao Master's path. If the former was said to be stealing, then he was now the true owner of the Tao Master's path and directly taking it. The difference between the two was self-evident. Luo Fan stood there quietly with an indescribable expression on his face. His heart was filled with an indescribable joy. Then, he raised his head and looked up at the top of the steps. There was an indescribable light above the steps. It was a color that could not be described with words, and even more so, it was a mysterious light that could not be described with words. This kind of light filled the world and covered everything else, making it impossible for him to see clearly or see through anything. Not to mention the possibility that there might be a higher step. At this moment, he understood that the light represented the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. The reason why he could only see the endless light was very simple. It was because he had not yet stepped onto the fourth level, nor could he see through it. He did not know what the essence of the fourth level was. This was just like the third level he had seen before. Sure enough, the road to becoming a Tao Master is not so simple. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Even if he had seen through the Tao Master's path, and had even clearly manifested the ascension rules of the Tao Master's path, his understanding of the Tao Master's path was still insignificant. The mysteries hidden beyond his understanding were still endless, waiting for him to explore and absorb. Upon discovering this, he was both a little disappointed and a little delighted. Naturally, he was disappointed because there were things that he could not understand. He still could not see the truth of certain things. For someone like him who wanted to understand and control everything, this was naturally disappointing. However, at the same time, such a change also meant that he could still obtain endless benefits from this place. He could still comprehend many principles that he could not comprehend in the past. This was naturally something to be happy about. With all kinds of thoughts flashing in his mind, Luo Fan slowly withdrew his palm. As he withdrew his palm, the pulsation that belonged to the ascension rules of the Tao Master's path that was constantly transmitted from his hand was suddenly cut off. The indescribable vastness and mystery had greatly weakened. Of course, this did not mean that the steps in his eyes would disappear because of this. In fact, because of his previous gains, he felt that he could see the steps more clearly and intuitively. At this moment, he came back to his senses and turned to look at where the boy was. His eyes pierced through the endless space and time, illuminating all obstructions. He saw where the boy was, who knew how many worlds away from him, and his gaze met with the boy's. The two of them were separated by an unknown amount of space and time, and they stared at each other. After seeing the boy, Luo Fan only smiled and said, "I'm really sorry to have disturbed you, Taoist friend." Hearing this, the boy smiled bitterly. At present, the distance between him and Luo Fan was obviously beyond the range that a normal cultivator at this level could detect. He could see Luo Fan and grasp all the changes in that position because he relied on his authority in the third level of the Tao Master's path. In other words, he relied on the power of the third level itself, the power itself. However, at this time, when he found that Luo Fan could also see, hear, and talk to him through the infinite distance and the infinite space-time, he found that he was not surprised at all. Instead, he felt that this was a matter of course, as if this situation should have happened in the first place. Yi Futian should be able to do something that was impossible for a normal cultivator at this level. The emergence of this mentality obviously meant that in his heart, Luo Fan had already risen to a position that was almost omnipotent. If this appeared in the heart of an ordinary cultivator, it would be extremely normal. However, it appeared in front of him, a rogue cultivator who had become the ruler of the third level of the Tao Master's path, and even surpassed all the other disciples of the Tao Masters. This was obviously an incredible thing. Every time I see you, Taoist friend, I feel like my cultivation is simply a dog's body. The boy sighed, and there was an inexplicable sense of loss in his eyes. This sense of loss was inexplicably familiar to him, as if he had seen it too many times. His heart trembled slightly, and he knew that his feeling was not wrong. He had indeed seen this kind of loss too many times. However, he had seen this kind of loss in the past on other people, and it was because of him. Now it was the other way around, and it appeared in his heart, and it was because of him. Every dog has its day. I wonder when I can see this kind of loss in him. The boy sighed, and some inexplicable thoughts flashed through his mind. However, it was obvious that he could not say this out loud at this time. Therefore, he only had an inexplicable, strange expression on his face. Hearing the boy's words, Luo Fan only smiled. As for the strange expression on the boy's face, although he did not know what it meant, he knew that it was definitely not a congratulatory thought. However, at this time, he clearly did not have the mood to find out what the boy was thinking. He only smiled slightly and said, "It's just a coincidence. Compared to Tao's friend, this little achievement is nothing." As he spoke, the space-time around Luo Fan's body shook slightly, and it seemed to make his figure somewhat blurry. Seeing this, the boy's expression changed slightly. This kind of behavior, it was obvious that he was gradually going to transcend the third level. He had never seen this kind of situation from any other cultivator, and he did not even know that this kind of situation existed. Noticing the changes in his body, Luo Fan smiled bitterly and said, "As expected, I'm already close to my limit here. If I'm not careful and don't completely suppress it, I'll be instantly expelled from the third level." The boy's face was inexplicably envious as he said, "I didn't expect such a change. This time, my eyes have really been opened." Luo Fan only smiled and said, "In this situation, I don't have much time to chat with Tao's friend. Take care, Tao's friend." As he spoke, his body shook, and he had already disappeared from all of the boy's detection methods. It was as if he had already left the third level of the Tao Master's path in an instant. However, the boy obviously did not think so. If he had left just like that, why would he have suppressed himself to stay here? Since he had suppressed himself before, it was obvious that he would not completely give up just because he met Yi Qingyu. Under such circumstances, there was obviously only one possibility that he could not see Yi Qingyu. Yi Qingyu had once again used some unimaginable method to hide from Yi Qingyu's perception and detection, making it impossible for Yi Qingyu to discover his existence. An inexplicable frustration emerged in the boy's heart at this moment. This was not the first time that Luo Fan was unable to probe the other party. For him, who had always been almost invincible, the sense of frustration was self-evident. What's the point of competing with him? I'm really looking for trouble. After letting out a sigh, his figure flickered, and he disappeared once again, hiding in a place that only he knew existed. With his disappearance, the third level of the Tao Master's path seemed to return to its original state, as if nothing had happened. What the hell is going on? Why did such a change happen just now? Did the ruler achieve some kind of breakthrough? A Tao Master's disciple who controlled a certain kind of authority on the third level of the Tao Master's path asked the conspirator in bewilderment. The other Tao Master's disciples also chimed in at this moment, wanted to find out what exactly happened and how it would affect their future. The schemer could only laugh bitterly at this sort of prying. It wasn't a ruler. It was another expert. Who? The Tao Master's disciples asked in bewilderment. Their expressions were inexplicably bewildered. Hearing this, the conspirator sighed and said, "Can't you guess? Or do you not dare to believe it all?" The Tao Master's disciples were slightly stunned, and then they all smiled bitterly. Indeed, apart from the independent cultivator who dared to fight against the ruler, who else could it be? Compared to the boy's shock, the Tao Master's disciples who were just as knowledgeable were also extremely shocked. The independent cultivator was already so strong that it was completely unreasonable, and now he was even more powerful. How could they live? Luo Fan paid no attention to the shock and disbelief of the many cultivators at this moment. He was only 3,000 years away from the next great tribulation. This amount of time was so short that it could not even be compared to the blink of an eye for existences at his level. How could he not make the best use of such a short time to prepare? After all, it was the fifth great tribulation. The degree of danger could only be stronger than the fourth great tribulation, not weaker. He couldn't be any more aware of how dangerous the fourth tribulation was. The fifth great tribulation was even more dangerous than the fourth, and it went without saying how dangerous it was. How could he not be careful? At this moment, he was still on the third level of the Tao Master's path. However, He did not stay in a certain place to cultivate and wait. Instead, he began a walk on the third level. Outside of the boy's detection range, his figure constantly flickered. Every time he flickered, he seemed to have crossed the furthest distance of a great world. If it was calculated according to distance, it would probably be billions of light years away. Although he had been cultivating on the third level of the road of Tao Master for a long time, and had even participated in the great changes of the entire road of Tao Master, the distance he had walked on the third level was not considered much since he entered it. It could even be said to be very few. He was very clear about the mysteries and inconceivable principles of the third level. However, he had not seen many mysteries and principles with his own eyes. At this time, taking advantage of the time before the fifth Great Tribulation arrived, he was ready to see the many wonderful sights of the third level with his own eyes. He wanted to see the endless things that were helpful to cultivation. In addition to increasing his own knowledge, the most important thing was to prepare for the fifth Great Tribulation. After the third level of the Tao Master's path was completed, the number of places that were similar to the valley where he had obtained the foundation of the law attainment had increased by at least 100 times. There were quite a few cultivation grounds that were even better than the valley he had been in before. After the distance was no longer a limit, Luo Fan did not intend to give up any of the cultivation holy places. Therefore, in the next 3,000 years, Luo Fan left his mark in every cultivation holy place. For him, the quintessence and origin of every cultivation holy place were like an open warehouse, allowing him to use them at will. Every time he entered a cultivation holy place, he would use the fastest time possible. It could be a few years, a few days, or even a few breaths to obtain the true secrets of the cultivation holy place. After obtaining those secrets, he directly used the foundation of the law attainment that he had condensed at the beginning to fuse those secrets into it and gradually change the foundation of the law attainment. The foundation of the law attainment itself was a great world that was taking shape but could never be formed. More and more secrets, more and more mysteries, quintessence, and origin of the cultivation holy places were integrated into it. This was to constantly push the foundation of the law attainment towards a great world, allowing it to get closer and closer to the great world. Of course, no matter how close it got, the fundamental limit was that it could not really reach the level of the great world. However, although it could not truly reach the great world, every time it got a little closer to the great world, the mysteries and principles within it would become thousands of times more profound. In other words, every time the foundation of the law attainment moved a little closer to the great world, the benefits that Luo Fan could obtain would increase by thousands of times. To him, there was no need to explain how great the benefits were. It could be said that every time he passed by a cultivation holy place, the conditions for his future cultivation would increase by several times. Just like that, when the 3,000 years were about to pass, the foundation of the law attainment in his hand had already grown into something completely different from before. At this moment, the foundation of the law attainment had turned into a human figure. A figure was lying in the void. It was faintly discernible, and there were countless space and time surging inside it. Boundless heaven and earth flickered, and endless principles were constantly being born, dying, being created, and being destroyed. The figure's face was blurry, and it looked a little like Luo Fan, but it was also fundamentally different. The figure was not very big, only the size of a palm. As it lay on top of Luo Fan's palm, it was like a brand new image was being projected from his palm. Within the silhouette, one could find a worldview that was evolving. It was a worldview that was constantly being constructed, crumbled, and reconstructed, and one could also see that the endless worlds of other worlds were connecting, complementing, promoting, and clashing with each other, forming an indescribable balance as a whole. This dynamic balance was also the reason why the foundation of the law attainment was still the foundation of the law attainment. When this dynamic balance disappeared and was replaced by a stable balance, that is, when all the worldviews merged into a whole and became a real worldview on the level of the great heaven and earth, this foundation would no longer be the foundation of the great heaven and earth. Instead, it would truly become the embryonic form of the great heaven and earth. At that time, the great world would naturally break away from Luo Fan's control. It might even break away from the Tao Master Path and the great world of the Tao Master. It would enter a state of chaos and become another world within the state of chaos. It would be a great world that was waiting for the baptism of the great tribulation of the world to become truly eternal. Of course, this was only a theoretical development prospect. In reality, the foundation of the law attainment was the foundation for the development of something in the third level of the Tao Master Path. However, it could not reach the final stage and truly form the worldview of the great world. Naturally, it could not truly form the prototype of a great world, break away from Luo Fan's control, break away from the Tao Master Path, and become a great world of the Tao Master.